In the quiet rooms of Edinburgh and the bustling coffee houses where merchants and students urged each other toward clearer thinking, David Hume set out to chart a map of knowledge that begins not with what we wish to be true, but with what we actually experience. Section 1 of our voyage is called Method, Epistemology, and the Architecture of Knowledge, and it asks us to slow down enough to notice the very building blocks of what we call knowledge. It asks us to listen not to broad claims about truth alone, but to the way we come to those claims. What counts as evidence? What counts as reasoning? And what do our most confident beliefs rest on when the bright colors of sense and the faint glow of memory mingle in our minds? In our journey, we will move from the bustling context of the Scottish Enlightenment into the intimate lab of the mind, and we will watch how a seemingly simple division, impressions and ideas, opens onto questions that shape science, everyday belief, and even debates about religion and ethics. To begin, picture the setting. The late 17th and early 18th centuries in Britain and Europe were a time when natural philosophy, or science, was blossoming under Newton's influence. The air was thick with questions about how we know anything at all, how we justify the claims we make about the world, and how our own minds can be trusted to deliver reliable ideas rather than convenient fictions. Into this milieu steps Hume, a man steeped in the experimental spirit of his age and yet intent on rewriting how we understand the mind. He writes not as a mere theorist, but as someone who wants to map the entire topography of human knowledge, from the first spark of sensation to the most elaborate generalization of science. He also speaks in a vocabulary that he insists on clarifying: impressions, ideas, association, habit, cause, effect, and the fork between relation of ideas and matters of fact. These are not just terms. They are the scaffolding on which we will hang every claim about what we can know, what we cannot, and why we are often compelled to believe what we are not logically guaranteed to know. First, we must attend to the distinction that will organize much of what follows: impressions and ideas. Hume begins with the most basic psychological claim about what the mind actually encounters. An impression is something vivid, lively, forceful. It is the immediate sensation we feel, seeing a bright color, hearing a loud sound, feeling heat, tasting salt, a memory that comes rushing back with its pull of emotion. It is the strong, lively perception that makes us feel as if the world is tapping us on the shoulder. An idea, by contrast, is calmer, weaker, a kind of copy of that original sensation. It is the faint image we entertain in the mind when the sense has quieted, or when we think back to what we once experienced. The idea of heat, for example, is not heat itself but a memory or a conceptual representation that stands in for heat. The idea of a triangle is not a present triangle before my eyes, but a mental construction shaped by past impressions of shapes, lines, and geometric demonstrations. In a telling line that recurs across his work, Hume emphasizes that all thoughts that pass through the mind in the form of reflection are, in their origin, grounded in these impressions. The mind does not conjure up new colors from nowhere. It copies, rearranges, and reassembles impressions into ideas. Let us dwell with two concrete illustrations because they anchor the abstract claim in lived experience. The first concerns color. If I fix my gaze on a red apple, the color I see is a powerful, immediate impression. The hue seems to burn, to glow, to demand attention, to be in the moment. It is saturated with sensation, and I am struck by its vividness. Yet if I close my eyes or remove the apple, I can still entertain the idea of that color. I can imagine red, I can recall the shade of that moment, and I can talk about redness even without present color. That imagined color, the idea of red, is a diminished, less forceful replica of the impression. It is not identical to the live sensation, but it is a mental echo that allows us to think about red even when the blue sky has replaced the apple in view. The second illustration moves from sensation to abstraction, a triangle. Perhaps I have never stood directly in front of a flawless geometric ideal that matches every possible triangle. Still, I can form the idea of a triangle, 3 corners, 3 sides, with internal angles summing to 180 degrees. That idea is not a primitive sensation like a color. It is a constructed figure, an abstract concept built in part from countless impressions of lines, shapes, and the mathematical demonstrations I have learned. The key point is that ideas of this sort do not float outside of impression. They are copies, however imperfect, of impressions that I have previously felt or seen or heard. Where memory and imagination play their intimate roles, the copy principle begins to take shape. The copy principle is the claim that the mind does not generate ideas anew from nothing. Instead, every idea we entertain is a more feeble copy of some impression we have once felt or experienced. When we compose a complex idea, we are assembling a collection of simpler ideas, and those simpler ideas themselves are copies of more primitive impressions. This is not a claim about linguistic habits or social practice alone. It is a claim about the very architecture of thought. The mind, in Hume's telling, is a workshop where impressions are the raw material and ideas are the products that imagination and memory fashion from those raw materials. The principle is simple to state, and it will become one of the most contested and fruitful aspects of his philosophy. If all ideas are copies of impressions, then every claim to knowledge must, at bottom, be traceable to an original experiential source. If an idea cannot be traced to a past impression, it must be suspect as a product of the mind's fancy rather than of nature's givenness. To see the reach of this claim, consider two more layered examples. The first is causation. Suppose I observe that every time I strike a match, it lights. Every time I turn the tap, water flows. From these repeated observations, I form an expectation. The flame will burn again if I strike the match again. Water will flow when the tap is opened. The impression here is not merely the sensory event of seeing a flame ignite or feeling the water rush forth. It is the sense of a connection that seems to be more than a single impression. The mind, however, does not derive the necessary connection from a sequence of impressions alone. Rather, it constructs the idea of causation by habit, from the repeated conjunction of events, so that we expect future events to resemble past ones. This is not to deny that patterns exist in nature, but it is to insist that the belief in a necessary connection is a mental habit, a product of the way our memory and imagination weave past experiences into expectations about the future. Another way to phrase this is to say that the mind learns to project itself forward by reproducing in its own experience the order it has repeatedly encountered, and in doing so it treats a regular conjunction as if it encoded a law of nature rather than a mere sequence. The second example is memory itself. When I recall a friend's familiar voice, the remembered impression is not the same thing as the live sound of the voice. The voice that comes to mind is an idea. It is a livelier, more vivid memory, but not the exact vibrancy of the original sound. If I recount a past event, the memory image is a recreation, not a photograph. It may be a faithful copy, or it may be altered by the imagination. This demonstrates how impressions, once stored, can be reworked into ideas with cosmetic changes, some faithful, some distortive. In this way, memory becomes a bridge between the past and the present, a reservoir from which the mind induces new combinations, even new beliefs, as it construes what happened, how it happened, and why it matters. From these micro-examples, we can see how memory and imagination are not mere passive legacies of experience. They are active engines that rework impressions into coherent knowledge structures. They perform the work of reasoning, not in the sense of deducing necessary truths from pure principles, but in the sense of organizing experience so that life remains intelligible and navigable. Yet if all our ideas come from impressions, and if memory and imagination continually rework impressions into ideas, then how secure is our knowledge? This leads us to the next big turn in Hume's architecture. The copy principle itself, and beyond that, the fork, the decisive judgment about what can be known and how. The copy principle is not a sterile dermatology of mental life. It is a claim about the source of justification for our beliefs. If every idea is a copy of some impression, then the confidence we place in our most settled propositions depends on the strength and frequency of the corresponding impressions. Mathematics and logic, for Hume, present a special case of the same general pattern, but with a nuance that becomes crucial when we separate analytic from synthetic claims. The starting point, however, is the same. Ideas have their roots in lived perception. The world we claim to know, whether a color, a triangle, a cause, or a moral sentiment, enters our minds first as an impression, and only later as an idea if the impression has a memory or an imagined echo in the mind. This brings us to the fork, the famous distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. The fork divides the landscape of human knowledge into two broad kinds of claim. On the one hand lies the domain of relation of ideas, a priori truths that are discoverable by reasoning about definitions and logical connections. Here we find mathematics and logic, where the truth is contained in the meanings of the terms and the logical structure itself. If you analyze a proposition like the whole is greater than the part, you are stepping into a relation of ideas. Your justification lies in the meanings of the terms and the logical form. These claims, Hume argues, are necessarily and universally true by virtue of their logic, not because of any experience about the world. They are resolutely analytic in a way that makes them, in principle, immune to a miracle in experience. On the other hand lies the domain of matters of fact, contingent truths about the world, our beliefs that the sun will rise tomorrow, that water boils at sea level, that honest men exist, that nations covet power. These claims are not grounded in the definitions or the logical structure of thought alone. They require evidence from experience. They are not necessarily true in the same sense. They could be otherwise given different circumstances. Now, because we can only know matters of fact through impressions, through sensory experience, memory, and the mind's operations, our knowledge of them is always, in principle, probabilistic, fallible, and subject to revision. This is not gloom for knowledge. It is a sober acknowledgement of the limits and conditions under which we actually know anything beyond the tautological truths of logic and mathematics. Hume's fork is not a petty division. It is a way of keeping us honest about what we claim to know and on what ground we claim it. If a claim sounds universal, necessary, or a priori, we should ask, does it derive from the relation of ideas, or does it depend on some probable inference about matters of fact? And if the latter, how much of our confidence is warranted by the strength of the impressions we have and by the regularity of their conjunctions in memory and habit? The fork forces a double discipline. It guards us against mistaking hypothetical or assumed necessities for genuine necessities, and it also warns us against overconfident claims about the future when such claims are tethered only to past impressions. The real world in Hume is an intricate network of habitual expectations, memory traces, and patterns that seem to us to be laws, when in fact they are the sonorous music of the mind playing on the strings of experience. If the fork marks the boundary lines of what we can truly claim to know in a strict sense, the question then becomes how these ideas acquire momentum in the life of inquiry. This is where habit and custom step into the spotlight. For Hume, habit is not merely a self-indulgent comfort that helps us function. It is the glue that binds our inferences, the engine that keeps science turning, the wind in the sails of everyday prediction. When we repeatedly observe a certain conjunction, a ball dropped, a candle burned, a magnet drawn toward iron, we begin to expect that a similar event will occur again in the same circumstances. This expectation is not a logical deduction. It is a felt propensity, a mental habit that makes future experience intelligible. The mind's power of habit therefore becomes one of the primary engines of scientific reasoning and practical forecast. Induction, for Hume, grows out of habit rather than out of demonstrative inference. We do not deduce that the sun will rise tomorrow from the nature of the sun or from the structure of reasoning. We project past order onto future time because our minds are habituated to expect it. It is worth pausing here to see the broader consequences of this account for everyday belief and for theoretical science. If we take seriously the claim that knowledge of matters of fact rests on impressions formed through experience and on the habitual expectations that memory and imagination assemble, then science itself becomes, at its roots, a disciplined habit of anticipating regularities. Newton's mathematics and experimental method, celebrated across the era as the model of how to know the world, sits in a line of influence with Hume's skeptical caution. If the world often behaves in regular ways, we can build reliable concepts and predictions. If it does not, our best justified beliefs will still be shaped by the patterns our own minds have learned to expect. This is not a denial of science. It is a call to humility about the grounds of justification and a reminder that the very success of science rests on a robust, if not infallible, habit of trust in experienced regularities. Let us shift now from the mechanics of mind to the wider implications these claims bear for our understanding of religion and morality, but with the caveat that we will keep the discussion tethered to epistemology. Hume is rarely content to applaud a claim about belief unless it can be traced back to some experiential basis. When it comes to religion, his famous skepticism about miracles and his examination of religious testimony arise not from a refusal to consider metaphysical questions, but from a demand to ground those beliefs in the same kind of experience that underwrites ordinary knowledge. If a miracle claims a violation of the laws of nature, we must ask what sensations or impressions would accompany such a claim, what memory traces of past testimonies exist, and whether the habitual expectations we rely on actually warrant the belief that the event occurred. If they do not, the rational force of the miracle claim is undermined, not simply by argument, but by the very structure of how we acquire knowledge. In ethics, Hume's focus remains epistemological as a stage set for later moral philosophy. If moral judgments arise from sentiments, sympathy, approval, disapproval, then their force will ultimately be measured by how reliably those sentiments can be traced through impression and habit to shared human experience. The ethical claims, though, will emerge from the way we understand human nature and the limits of our reasoning about it. The religious claims will emerge from how far experience and testimony can sustain beliefs about things beyond the immediate reach of observation. We should now place Hume in dialogue with the major thinkers who shaped and challenged him. John Locke's empiricism and George Berkeley's idealism light the path that Hume takes and questions him at crucial junctures. Locke's insistence on experience as the source of all ideas, he famously claimed that the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, provides the scaffolding for Hume's own rejection of innate ideas. But Locke's readiness to treat ideas as the products of experience also leaves room for Hume to sharpen the edges. If all ideas are copies of impressions, what then becomes of substantive content that seems to reach beyond sense? Berkeley then presses the problem in a different direction, arguing that existence depends on perception, to be is to be perceived. Hume remains empirically anchored but refuses to surrender the external world altogether. He tests the limits of what can be said about the world as it presents itself in impressions, and thus he both borrows and resists Berkeley's emphasis on perception as ultimate. Then there is Kant, who enters the conversation as a later critic who notices that Hume's critique of causation, his argument that we do not arrive at necessary connection by observation alone, awakens the possibility that human understanding imposes structure on experience. Kant's famous claim that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers signals the transformation that followed. Perhaps the mind brings to experience certain forms, such as space, time, and causal precedents, that make experience possible in the first place. The result is not a surrender of empiricism, but a reconfiguration. The fork is kept, but the necessary connections of causation and the organizing capacities of the mind are now seen as the preconditions for experience rather than as mere postulates of inference. Newton's scientific method and the broader Newtonian project form the backdrop to Hume's inquiry in another way. The era's confidence in natural philosophy, the idea that the world operates under intelligible laws and that careful observation and rigorous argument can reveal them, provides both inspiration and testing ground. Hume's sober analysis of habit, inference, and the limits of empirical justification is a counterpoint to the confident claim that all natural phenomena can be finally understood through demonstration. In a sense, Hume is not opposing science. He is insisting on the epistemic humility that must accompany science when its conclusions rest on the fragile bridge between observed regularities and assumed generalizations about future phenomena. In this sense, Hume's method and epistemology preserve the spirit of Newtonian inquiry while demanding a more rigorous mindfulness about the ground of our inferences. The tension between Newton's success and Hume's caution becomes a productive tension that later thinkers would explore, between a pragmatic confidence in the predictive power of science and a rigorous scrutiny of the foundations of scientific justification. To illuminate how these ideas moved through history, we turn to two kinds of anecdotes that illuminate Hume's reception and influence. The first concerns the treatise of human nature itself, published in 1739–1740. Upon its appearance, the treatise did not spark the blaze of immediate acclaim one might expect from such a bold project. It was greeted with curiosity, but not with popular enthusiasm. Contemporary readers admired certain strokes, the depth of psychological observation and the audacity of the program, but they also found the work difficult, its scope sprawling, its prose dense, its structure not yet tempered for public reception. The treatise did not become a bestseller. Rather, it circulated in manuscript form among a devoted circle of readers and students in universities. Yet within a generation, a different mood took hold. The Enlightenment, with its love of critical examination and its respect for human faculties, began to rediscover Hume as a vigilant diagnostician of the mind. The formal essays in his moral and political treatises and his later inquiries became the vehicles by which his ideas moved into wider circulation. The revival is not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual conversion of interest. From suspicion to admiration, from curiosity to standard reference. Readers in the mid-18th century began to see in Hume a mind capable of rigorous, skeptical inquiry that did not abandon the human need for knowledge, but insisted we ground our confidence in what experience can justify and how habit shapes our expectations. The revival often occurs through the work of influential interpreters, students and philosophers who translated the treatise's questions into the terms of their own time, who wrote letters, journals, and reviews, and who introduced new audiences to Hume's method. A second anecdote concerns the Edinburgh and broader Scottish Enlightenment, where Hume was not a distant theorist but a living participant in a lively exchange of ideas. He circulated in the same circles as Adam Smith, the moral philosopher who would later publish the theory of moral sentiments and, still more famously, the Wealth of Nations. This is not a story of solitary genius but of a community, a network of scholars who gathered, debated, and refined their thoughts in lectures, coffee houses, and intimate salons. Hume's influence among these peers was substantial, even when not always explicit. He offered a way of examining human faculties, perception, memory, imagination, belief, that provided a framework for Smith's own inquiries into moral psychology and social order. It is not an overstatement to say that their informal conversations and shared concerns about how humans form beliefs, how societies cultivate cooperation, and how law and religion fit into human life contributed to a distinctive Scottish stance toward knowledge. Cautious yet optimistic about human capacity, skeptical of overreaching claims, and deeply attentive to the role of language, habit, and sentiment in shaping truth. We should also highlight cross-references to related ideas and thinkers that will recur throughout our discussion. Empiricism versus rationalism is not a minor footnote here. It is the axis on which Hume turns the debate between how we come to know and what we can claim to know. The analytic-synthetic distinction, while later formalized by Kant and others, has its first serious articulation in discussions that Hume's fork invites. Analytic truths are about the logic of concepts, while synthetic truths depend on how the world is and how our impressions accumulate into belief. Hume's emphasis on skepticism, though not a nihilistic skepticism, warns that many of our most cherished beliefs rest on habits of thought rather than demonstrable necessity. This is a kind of skepticism designed not to paralyze inquiry but to purify it, to insist that we distinguish what is certain from what is probable, and to remind us that even our most secure beliefs about science and common life are ultimately tethered to the sturdiness of memory, the continuity of experience, and the trust we place in the regularities of nature. We should anticipate two kinds of counterarguments that many readers and later philosophers have offered in response to Hume, two open questions that we will explore in this video and that we will acknowledge as fruitful avenues for ongoing discussion. The first is Kant's crucial critique. Hume shows that much of what we take as necessary in our understanding of causation is not derived from reason's own powers, but is imposed by the mind's need to organize experience. Kant then asks whether there are a priori structures that make experience possible at all, thereby offering a bridge between the empiricist's insistence on experience and the rationalist's demand for necessary conditions of cognition. In this light, Hume's skepticism about causation becomes a trigger rather than a conclusion. It invites us to consider whether there are preconditions of experience, space, time, categories of understanding, perhaps even a form of systemic organization, that the mind imposes so that the world can be grasped at all. Kant's project is thus a response to Hume's unsettling discovery, not a repudiation of it, and it helps explain why Hume's work is often read as a hinge between early modern empiricism and later German idealism. The second counterargument comes from a more contemporary direction, a pragmatist or Bayesian reading that reframes the copy principle as a heuristic rather than a hard deduction. If we think of ideas as copies of impressions, one might worry that this makes thought a slavish echo chamber of experience, leaving little room for creative inference or for the robust, rational reconstruction of probability in uncertain situations. A pragmatist could say that the value of beliefs lies in their usefulness, coherence with experience, and capacity to guide action under conditions of uncertainty, rather than in their strict derivation from impression. A Bayesian interpretation would emphasize how our priors, our background assumptions, shape how we update beliefs when confronted with new data, thus reframing habit as a rational strategy for navigating probability rather than a blind allegiance to past impressions. In this vein, the copy principle remains a provocative starting point, but not a final verdict about the nature of justification. The value of sex of the discussion is not to close the door on such readings, but to invite us to see how Hume's framework can be harmonized with or challenged by these later philosophies. If this longer arc of inquiry is to be productive, we must also provide a clear map for further exploration. We propose dividing the discussion into 6 subparts, each offering a careful depth of analysis, evocative examples, and opportunities for cross-referencing to related thinkers and ideas. The subparts are impressions and ideas. Here we rehearse the distinction in full, with vivid, concrete examples that bring the theory to life. We will linger on how memory and imagination rework impressions into ideas, and we will use 2 or more examples to show how this process plays out in ordinary life and in intellectual work. The copy principle, we will unpack the claim that every idea is a copy of an impression, and we will trace its implications for how we understand the origin of complex ideas, the formation of beliefs, and the motivation behind rational inference. We will consider the limits of the principle and how it bears on questions of meaning, mathematics, and the claims of science. the fork. In this segment, we will explore the two realms Hume identifies, relations of ideas and matters of fact, how each is justified, and what the bite of the fork means for how we assess claims about the world. We will use examples from science, mathematics, and everyday life to illuminate the divide and its philosophical consequences. Habit and induction. Here the role of habit as the glue of inference takes center stage. We will discuss the mechanics of induction, the problem of induction in its historical visibility, and how habit functions as the engine by which prediction becomes reliable, even in the absence of strict logical justification. The origins of knowledge in everyday life. This section tracks how, from raw impressions and the machinery of memory and imagination, a practical, usable world emerges. We will examine how science builds on this foundation and how culture, language, and social practice contribute to the reliability of our knowledge claims. The place of skepticism. Finally, we encounter skepticism not as a dead end, but as a tool that tests our most confident beliefs. We will see how Hume's brand of skepticism strips away unwarranted certainty while leaving room for credible inference, explanation, and progress. We will connect skepticism to practical wisdom, scientific method, and moral life. Throughout these subparts, we will interweave quotes from primary sources to illuminate the texture of Hume's argument. We will assign particular attention to core formulations. The claim that all the perceptions of the mind are, in their first appearance, either impressions or ideas, and that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. We will consider how the copy principle expresses the idea that all our ideas are copies of our impressions, and we will examine how the fork partitions knowledge into analytic and synthetic, necessity and contingency. We will also bring in cross-references to Locke's emphasis on experience as the source of ideas, Berkeley's idealism as a provocative counterpoint, Kant's response as a historical pivot, and Newton's empirical program as the scientific horizon within which these debates unfold. In preparing for the detailed analysis that follows, let me offer you an orientation about what you can expect to hear. We will begin with a careful, patient walk through impressions and ideas, listening for the way the mind distinguishes the lively from the faint and the real from the remembered. We will then move to the copy principle, tracing how this distinction underwrites the entire epistemic enterprise. We will turn to the fork to ask what counts as knowledge in the first place and how exactly we justify what we claim to know. We will then investigate habit and induction, which reveals both the strength and the fragility of our scientific and everyday inferences. We will examine how knowledge originates in everyday life, how impressions, memory, and social practice fashion a credible world we can live in. Finally, we will pause with skepticism, not to despair, but to refine our toolkit for critical reflection, and we will look ahead to how later thinkers will extend or challenge Hume's architecture. We should not pretend that this map is merely an abstraction. It is a map that will you listen to the voices of two great ships in the same sea, empiricism and rationalism. It is a map that will rely on the analytic language of ideas and the synthetic reality of experience, and it will insist that when we claim knowledge of the world, we should be prepared to show how our claim is anchored in impression, memory, habit, and the future life of experience. It is a map that invites us to consider what we mean by justification and what we can responsibly claim to know about science, everyday life, and even the life of belief. And it is, above all, a map that invites ongoing conversation, with Locke and Berkeley looking back at the roots of empiricism, with Kant turning our impulses toward the necessity of the mind's forms, with Newton guiding the disciplined search for natural laws, and with the many readers who, over the centuries, have found in Hume a way to think with both firmness and humility about knowledge. To close this opening, I want to pause with a few direct touchstones from primary sources that will recur as we move through the sections. Hume writes, all the perceptions of the mind are, in their first appearance, either impressions or ideas. This sharp division will thread through our discussions as a constant point of reference. He adds the companion line that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, a reminder that our rational faculties operate within the broader field of human motivation and sentiment. He also gives us the ambition of the copy principle. All our ideas are copies of our impressions. These lines are not mere slogans. They are commitments about how the mind works and about how we should approach knowledge, evidence, and justification. They provide the scaffolding for a disciplined inquiry that will demand that we know not only what we claim to know, but where our ground for belief actually rests. As we proceed into subsequent segments, we will maintain a calm, reflective tone, allowing the weight of the ideas to guide us. We will move slowly from the vividness of impressions to the quiet reliability of ideas, from the force of habit to the humility of skeptical inquiry, and from the straightforward claims of everyday knowledge to the larger questions about science, religion, and ethics that these foundations make possible to ask. The aim is not to settle every dispute in a single sitting, but to invite you into a thoughtful process of listening, questioning, and connecting, across epochs, across thinkers, across the ordinary and extraordinary events that shape what we call knowledge. If we keep the mind open to the interplay of impression, memory, habit, and inquiry, we will be well prepared for the next steps of our voyage, into how Hume's distinctive vocabulary and method illuminate the architecture of knowledge, and how later thinkers will take up the torch to push the dialogue forward. We begin this section by turning our attention to a problem that sits at the very heart of how we think about the world around us. It is a problem that is old as science itself, and as intimate as the moment you step outside and notice the sun coming up, as intimate as the way your body seems to react to a familiar cough in a crowded room. It is the problem of induction and constant conjunction. How do we infer that one thing causes another simply because the two things have appeared together again and again? And if we can infer a cause from repeated observation, what justifies those inferences when there is no guaranteed, logical connection built into the nature of things? We will begin with the problem of induction as Hume formulated it, and we will anchor that discussion in two vivid examples that make the dialectic come alive. Consider the first example, one that any student of science or any attentive watcher of the skies can recognize. For countless generations, people have observed that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Day after day, the sun climbs above the horizon, bright and firm, and then sinks away. From this constant conjunction, sunrise associated with a future sunrise, most of us come to expect that tomorrow will be like today, and the day after, and the day after that. We form the belief that the sun will rise again because, in the past, the pattern has held. But what justifies this belief in a strict, necessary connection between sun and sunrise? Hume would remind us that there is no observed necessity in that sequence. We have not encountered a universal law that dictates the sun must rise. We have only observed a regularity, a habit of sequence that has impressed itself upon our experience. The world does not reveal to us a logical entailment that the future must resemble the past. It offers us a pattern, and our minds, hungry for order, fill that pattern with expectation. The habit of expecting sunrise tomorrow rests on nothing more than repeated observation and the mind's propensity to connect events that co-occur. Now imagine a second example that sits closer to the laboratories where modern science is born. A medical test, let us say a particular blood marker, that often accompanies a certain diagnosis. Suppose the test has repeatedly produced a positive result for individuals who do carry the disease and a negative result for those who do not. The correlation is strong, the pattern is consistent across a long string of cases, and thus the test becomes a trusted instrument of diagnosis. Yet the fact that the test has repeatedly correlates with the disease does not guarantee that the disease is present whenever the test reads positive, nor that every instance of the disease will always light up the test in exactly the same way. In other words, despite the impressive track record of this test, there is no logical guarantee that a positive result confirms the diagnosis with absolute certainty. Induction tells us to expect that the future will resemble the past in this matter as well, but the claim that the past's pattern guarantees the future is precisely what Hume wants us to scrutinize. The rock of justification here is not a razor-thin proof carved into nature. It is a habit of thought reinforced by observation, tempered by the recognition that we live in a world where surprise can still occur. So what is at stake in these examples? An intuition we all rely on daily, that repeated conjunctions create a kind of expectation that feels almost as if it were a fact built into the world. Hume sifts through this intuition with his characteristic economy and candor. He asks us to notice that our inferences about causes do not derive from demonstrable connections we observe in nature. We observe only constant conjunctions, that whenever event A occurs, event B has also occurred, without ever perceiving a necessary bond that obliges it to bring about B. The passage from observed regularities to causal necessity is not a chain of deductive steps, but a leap of psychological association. It is our habit, our custom, our mental wiring, that leads us to infer that a cause is B, to expect B whenever we see A, to act as if the two are bound by some inner tie. This is not to deny the empirical success of our causal judgments, but it is to insist that their justification rests on the mind's pervasively influential tendency to project order onto experience, not on a necessary connection laid down by the fabric of reality itself. Hume's central claim, then, is not that there are no causal relations or that science is worthless. He is careful to distinguish what we can know by reasoning from what we find in the mere habit of mind. In his famous division of human understanding, he treats matters of fact as the objects of empirical inquiry, to be derived from experience, while relations of ideas are, in a sense, knowable by reason alone. And even this seemingly clear division is complicated by what we learn about causation. The connection we posit between cause and effect depends on nothing in the nature of the observed events themselves that demands necessity. Instead, it arises from the mind's policy of expecting constant conjunctions to go on in the future as they have in the past. In short, our belief in causal regularities is a product of habit, not of demonstrable reasoning from first principles. If we slow the scene down and listen to this line of reflection, we hear a reframing of science itself. No longer do we see science as a catalog of necessary laws inscribed in nature, as if the universe were a machine with inexorable gears. Instead, we see science as an organized discipline of recognizing stable patterns, testing them against experience, refining them when anomalies appear, and drawing the line between what is reliably repeatable and what remains uncertain. In this sense, science becomes, in Hume's telling, a disciplined practice of patterns rather than a metaphysical inventory of necessary laws. This reframing does not render science trivial or baseless. It recasts its confidence as rationally practical, grounded in successful prediction and control, rather than in claims to know the universe's deepest necessities. To sharpen this two-sourced frame of the discussion, we must hold two ideas side by side. First, there is the claim that some truths are relations of ideas, that is, truths that are true by virtue of the meanings of the terms and definitions involved, and which experience cannot modify. Second, there are matters of fact, truths about the world that require experience for their justification, and that could be otherwise if the world were configured differently. Causation, for Hume, does not sit comfortably in the realm of relations of ideas, nor does it rest on guarantees that would be provided by rational insight into the nature of things. Instead, our causal inferences about matters of fact are built upon experience and, crucially, upon habit. This splits the terrain of knowledge into a double movement. Reason can examine the relations of ideas with their own internal contradictions and consistencies, but the claims we make about how the world works, about the causes of events, are grounded in the stable habits that govern our interactions with the world over time. And here we must face the two principal counterarguments that ring through the history of philosophy and science. The first is Kant's response. Immanuel Kant, reading Hume with the attention of a philosopher who had made a career out of trying to anchor knowledge in some solid ground, found in Hume's critique a wake-up call of unusual force. The famous moment Kant later recalled with a mixture of humor and gravity was that Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. What Hume had shown, Kant argued, was not that all knowledge is dubious, but that the preconditions for experience themselves are not supplied by empirical observation alone. Causality, space, and time are not things we observe as independent data, they are the forms through which the mind organizes experience. They are, in Kant's sense, synthetic a priori concepts. They shape how we must understand any possible experience, including causal relations. Thus, causation might not be a fact outright given to us by sensation, but a necessary framework the mind imposes to make sense of sensation as experience. In this light, the truth of causal relations is not derived from observed constant conjunctions alone, but arises, at least in part, from the structure of thought itself. The synthetic a priori claim is that the mind, by its very constitution, brings to experience the category of causality as a condition for any experience of events to be intelligible at all. Hume thereby reveals the limits of pure reason, but Kant suggests that reason, in its transcendental form, can still illuminate how experience is possible and why causal concepts are indispensable for anyone who hopes to know the world. The second counterargument is pragmatic or Bayesian in spirit, and it arrives from a different corner of intellectual life. Here, the defense of induction does not pretend to deliver metaphysical certainty about the laws of nature, but it defends the practical success of inductive reasoning as a guide to action. The pragmatic line, associated with later thinkers and more recently formalized in Bayesian probability, treats induction as a rational method of updating beliefs in light of evidence. It is not that the world guarantees that the sun will rise tomorrow in every possible sense. Rather, it is that, given our prior beliefs and the strength of the observed correlations, updating those beliefs in light of new data yields the most coherent and useful stance we can take to navigate the world. In this reading, induction is a matter of decision under uncertainty. The uniformity of nature becomes a working assumption, a prior probability in the Bayesian sense that allows us to structure our expectations and plans. Probability and statistics enter the scene as tools rather than metaphysical claims. They quantify the strength of our beliefs, track the rate at which our confidence should grow or decay as evidence accumulates, and provide a disciplined method for distinguishing genuine regularities from mere noise or rare contrivances. In this sense, the Kantian insight, "there are preconditions to experience," finds a surprisingly compatible ally in the Bayesian account, which accepts that we live in a world where certainty is elusive, but rational action remains possible through principled belief revision. To weave these arguments into a broader narrative about the origins and trajectory of the problem, we must turn to the historical soils in which Hume's critique germinated. The Enlightenment was not a sterile debate between skeptics and dogmatists. It was a social and intellectual movement that reimagined how knowledge is pursued. The rise of the scientific method, with its insistence on observation, experiment, and replication, created a powerful context for Hume's questions. The scientific method did not simply reveal naked laws of nature, it demanded confidence in the means by which those laws are discovered, tested, and validated. In this sense, Hume's critique can be read as a radical call to examine the foundations of our scientific practices themselves. What counts as evidence? How do we justify our extrapolations from the observed to the unobserved? What role do we assign to the engineer's confidence in a theory, or the physician's confidence in a diagnostic test, once we acknowledge that we cannot guarantee necessity or certainty? The history of the induction debate has two particularly vivid turns that illuminate how these ideas have evolved in science and philosophy. The first is Kant's reception of Hume in the wake of his own critical project. Kant's moment of awakening, as it is told, marks a transition from a speculative skepticism toward a more structured empiricism that still seeks universal conditions for knowledge. Kant does not discard induction or causal reasoning. He redefines them as rooted, at least in part, in the mind's own architecture. The second turn is the Enlightenment's own social and methodological expansion, the way scientific inquiry became a collective enterprise, a community of experimenters and observers across Europe and beyond. The Royal Society in London, the academies of Berlin and Paris, the widespread adoption of experimental design, and the cross-pollination of ideas across salons and coffeehouses all created a climate in which Hume's critique could be tested, contested, and refined. The scientific method hardened not by denying induction, but by shaping a disciplined, communal practice in which induction could be studied, criticized, and improved. As we trace this trajectory, two more strands warrant attention because they illuminate the enduring value and the limits of Hume's perspectives. One strand flows from the concept of uniformity of nature, a notion that underwrites induction by supposing that the future will resemble the past because the world has a coherent regularity that persists across time and space. Hume challenges us to see that uniformity is not something we observe directly in nature, but something we infer from experience, something we rely on to make sense of the world. The other strand is the role of probability and statistics in knowledge. The development of probability theory, statistics, and more recently, Bayesian inference, reframes induction as an epistemic tool for measuring degrees of belief, not as a metaphysical guarantee of truth. These threads help us see how Hume's critique of necessity can be reconciled with a modern scientific practice that is both robust and fallible, cautious and ambitious. If we push further into the conversation, we discover how Hume's ideas ripple through the work of later philosophers of science. John Stuart Mill, for one, confronted the challenge of induction by formulating methods of experimental inquiry designed to extract general truths from a field of singular observations. Mill's methods of induction were an attempt to codify a disciplined empirical practice that could produce reliable knowledge while acknowledging the inescapable limits Hume had spotlighted. Later still, Karl Popper offered a provocative counterweight. He argued that science should proceed by conjectures and bold falsification rather than by deriving unbroken inductive generalizations from observations. For Popper, the problem is not that induction is impossible, but that it cannot establish universal truth. Science advances by testing bold theories and discarding those that fail, thereby preserving a throughline of critical scrutiny in place of the comforting, but ultimately suspect, assurance of inductive sufficiency. In this way, Hume's legacy is not simply a verdict against induction. It becomes a historical spark that kindled a chain of responses across the 20th century, each one trying to balance the demand for reliable knowledge with the humility that arises when we recognize the limits of our rational grasp. To deepen our sense of connection, we can draw cross-references to other ideas and thinkers that enrich the topic. The uniformity of nature, as I mentioned, is not a self-evident axiom, but a working principle that rationalizes the use of past regularities to predict future states. The history of probability and statistics offers another well-lit avenue of connection. The wild, early attempts to quantify likelihoods, the development of frequentist and Bayesian schools, and the modern understanding that probability represents rational degrees of belief under uncertainty, not some mirror of a metaphysical probability baked into the world. The Bayesian framework in particular reframes confidence as a function of prior information and accumulating evidence, aligning surprisingly well with a disciplined, problem-solving mindset that would have pleased even a cautious Humean skeptic, provided one accepts probability as a guide to belief rather than a metaphysical guarantee of truth. In a broader sense, the idea of inference to the best explanation, often associated with Pearson later, revived by philosophers such as Bos van Frossen and Gilbert Harman, offers a way to see how scientists often proceed when multiple hypotheses can explain the data. It is not a guarantee of truth, but a rationally justified choice among competing accounts given the available evidence. And there are practical, real-world consequences. The way we train engineers and scientists to design experiments, the manner in which clinical trials are interpreted, the use of control groups, the replication culture that has become a cornerstone of modern science, these are all shaped, directly or indirectly, by the legacy of the induction problem. When a medical test claims high predictive value, the responsible practitioner will always consider base rates, prior probabilities, and the possibility of confounding factors. When a climate model attempts to forecast future conditions, scientists must be transparent about assumptions and uncertainties and ready to revise models as new data arrives. All of these practices embody in different guises the humbling insight that Hume helped to articulate, that our knowledge of external reality rests on patterns of experience, not on necessary connections guaranteed by nature, and that our rational life must proceed with a disciplined humility about what our habits can and cannot justify. As we close this segment, let me offer you a plan for expanding this discussion in the long form, a plan that matches the structure you asked for and keeps the conversation anchored in the historical and philosophical core. We will move through 5 substantial subsections, not as mere labels, but as living parts of the narrative that you will hear unfold across the next portions of the video. First, induction and habit. We will examine in greater depth how habit forms the bedrock of our causal judgments, how repeated exposure creates expectations, how this habit interacts with the language of science, and how we might distinguish between predictive success and ontological necessity. We will bring in more historical episodes from the Scottish Enlightenment, from the schools of thought that fed into the experimental method, and we will explore how probability begins to creep into the conversation, raising questions about measurement and interpretation, about sample sizes and experimental design, and about how to read a failure as a sign not merely of error, but of the limits of induction. Second, the problem of miracles and skepticism. We will reconstruct Hume's argument about miracles, their testimonial burden, and the way claims of miracle interact with the uniformity of nature. We will look at the practical consequences of this stance for religious belief, for public policy, and for how scientists evaluate extraordinary claims in medicine and physics. We will also compare Hume's stance with other skeptical traditions and with early responses from theologians who sought to reconcile miracle with natural law. We will bring in contemporary discussions about extraordinary claims, Bayesian reasoning about rare events, and how scientists weigh anecdotal evidence against large datasets. Third, the fork in action, reason versus custom. Here we will explore the deeper psychology of habit, the way that reason and custom compete in human life, and how this tension manifests in scientific practice. We will examine how the mind tests hypotheses, how priming and cognitive biases might influence our attributions of causality, and how the disciplined scientist tries to separate the quest for truth from the comfort of familiar patterns. We will also consider cross-cutting questions about why the human mind tends to seek stable explanations and how that impulse supports both scientific progress and, at times, stubborn dogma. Fourth, history of induction in science. We will place Hume in his historical context with more texture, recounting the rise of the scientific method in the Enlightenment as a social enterprise. We will explore the role of experiment, measurement, replication, and peer review, and we will trace how a culture of critical inquiry developed. We will examine not only Kant's reception of Hume, but also the broader European intellectual milieu, including the Newtonian program of unifying phenomena under universal laws, the Baconian dream of empirical method, and the collaboration of natural philosophy with empirical science. We will reflect on how this historical art prepared the ground for Mill's inductive methods, and for the later debates that would give rise to Popper's falsification and the subsequent evolutionary story of science. Fifth, philosophical replies and developments. In this final subsection, we will gather the diverse responses that have grown out of Hume's critique. We will discuss Kant's transcendental response, showing how it preserves the possibility of objective knowledge while limiting the scope of what can be claimed by pure reason alone. We will consider pragmatic defenses that accept the success of induction as a legitimate feature of rational life, even if metaphysical certainty remains out of reach. We will look at Mill's systematic methods of induction, at Popper's critique of induction and his emphasis on conjectures and refutations, and at the broader move toward a probabilistic and statistical understanding of knowledge. We will also connect to later developments in Bayesian theory, Bayesian networks, and the modern emphasis on inference under uncertainty, showing how contemporary science continues to wrestle with the same core questions Hume raised, now reframed in the language of statistics and information theory. In this long arc, you will hear repeated echoes of witnesses from the past: the quiet cave of the laboratory, the crowded bench where data are gathered, the chamber where a philosopher ponders the implications of a stubborn regularity. You will hear, too, the voices of contemporary thinkers who remind us that the questions Hume raised are not relics of a long-ago debate but living concerns that shape how we design experiments, how we interpret results, and how we live with the uncertainty that is an inescapable part of knowing anything about the external world. To honor the spirit of Hume's own method and to model the kind of careful, reflective inquiry he both demanded and made possible, let us end with a few anchoring quotes from primary sources, not to close the conversation, but to nudge us toward further listening and reflection. From the inquiry, we hear the line that has become a landmark in the philosophy of science: all inferences from experience are the effects of custom, not of reasoning. This is a sentence that invites us to pause, to feel the weight of its claim, and to consider how often our most confident judgments about cause and effect ride on the back of habit. And again, from Hume's broader program, the famous division of ideas and matters of fact still crops up in the mind as we ask whether a claim is necessarily true or merely observationally warranted. We should remember his caution that we do not have the same kind of certainty about matters of fact as we do about relations of ideas, and that the bridge from one domain to the other is not guaranteed by logic alone. As for a moment of historical texture, we can also keep in view that Kant's own remark about Hume is not merely a witty aside. It crystallizes a turning point in the history of philosophy. The recognition that the human mind does not passively receive data from the world, but actively structures that data through forms of intuition and categories of understanding. This recognition does not dissolve Hume's challenge, it reframes it. It asks us to understand how the mind's architecture makes experience possible, and in doing so, it opens a space for a more robust account of the rational grounds for scientific knowledge, grounds that must be found not in pure deduction from sense data, but in a more intricate conversation between the world that gives us data and the minds that organize that data into knowledge. And if we widen the lens still further, we see how Hume's critique interlocks with a broader tradition that seeks to explain how human beings live with uncertainty. The modern era, with its probabilistic reasoning, its reliance on statistical inference, and its acceptance of approximate, not absolute, knowledge, is, in a sense, the heirs of Humean skepticism reframed for new technologies, new methods, and new ambitions. The story of induction is not a tale of a single philosopher's doubt. It is a story of communities of inquiry learning to live with uncertainty, to quantify it, to test it, and to refine their practices in light of it. It is a story of how we have come to trust our best theories not because we have achieved final, unassailable certainty, but because we have built a resilient, repeatable method for navigating the world, one that remains, in essential ways, a disciplined form of habit, tempered by scrutiny, and guided by the shared hope that our patterns will endure long enough to help us flourish. If you have listened through these reflections, you may notice a gentle invitation embedded in them. The invitation to stay curious about how we settle on explanations, about what counts as justification, about how scientific communities defend their own practices, and about how much of our certainty is standing on the firm ground of observation, and how much of it is resting on the bedrock of habit and expectation. The invitation to think with Hume is not an invitation to abandon hope but to refine it, an invitation to recognize the limits of our rational insight into causation, to acknowledge the powerful role of habit in guiding our inferences, and to pursue a disciplined, patient, and richly interdisciplinary inquiry that draws on philosophy, history, statistics, and the practice of science itself. So as we proceed, we will keep circling back to the core questions Hume posed. What do we mean by cause? How do we justify induction? Is there a ground for our belief in the external world beyond what our senses supply, or is that belief simply a testament to the mind's own organization of experience? And how do Kant, Mill, Popper, and Bayesian thinkers help us answer those questions in the light of modern science, without surrendering the sense in which science has reshaped human life? These are not mere academic puzzles. They are questions that touch the way we live, the way we reason, and the way we imagine the world we share. In the end, the exploration of causation, induction, and knowledge about the external world is not just about Hume. It is about the kind of thinker you are willing to become when you stand, in calm, reflective mood, at the edge of the unknown, and listen to what the familiar patterns say about what might be possible tomorrow. Close your eyes for a moment and listen to the soft hum of your own thoughts. What is it you are at the bottom of your experience when you strip away the narratives you tell about yourself, the roles you play, the names you answer to, the stories you rehearse in the morning mirror? David Hume invites us to approach this question not with a sturdy, unshakable core, but with a patient, almost clinical curiosity. He asks us to attend to the flux of impressions that pass through the theater of the mind, and to recognize that the sense of a single, persisting self is not a given found in experience, but a construction that the mind erects out of a bundle of perceptions. The self, in Hume's most provocative phrasing, is not a thing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with astonishing speed and variety, and which our minds then stitch together into the plausibly seamless story of a single life. It is a radical move to deny a fixed, enduring essence and instead to treat identity as a kind of narrative byproduct of ordinary psychic life. Let us begin where Hume does, in the ground of his own writings. The living stream of perception. He will tell us in his own crisp, almost clinical voice that the mind is a theater and the perceptions are the actors, and he will insist on a crucial test, one that sounds almost merciless in its empiricism. Can we ever, in a direct moment of introspection, catalog a core self that persists under all changes of feeling, memory, and sensation? The answer he gives, with the gentleness of a skeptic who has seen too many illusions to trust easy assurances, is that we cannot. The self, as a stable substance, refuses to reveal itself in introspection. We only perceive heat, cold, pleasure, pain, love, hatred, memories, imaginings, and transitions between these states. The mind, in Hume's words, does not present a permanent I that lingers behind appearances. Rather, it gathers a chorus of perceptions and then calls that chorus by a name. And that naming your name, my name, the story of who I am, rests on habit, continuity, and the social and practical exigencies of life, not on a metaphysical guarantee. To enter into this topic with the depth it deserves, we must wander through the core claims, the central arguments, and the most implacable counterarguments. We must consider memory, imagination, and the transitions between states of consciousness. We must examine how the mind weaves a narrative of identity from a vivid, shifting stream of sensory experiences. And we must braid these reflections with the historical conversations that gave rise to Hume's bundle theory, including his conversations in the Scottish Enlightenment and the later debates it provoked. We shall also take a careful look at how contemporary thinkers Kant, Dennett, Parfit, and others re-illuminate the same ground from new angles, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes unsettling Hume's conclusions. All the while, we will pause at two concrete illustrations, meanwhile keeping a keen eye on the moral and social implications of thinking of the self as a bundle. First, a brief map of the terrain. The bundle theory is not a single tract of argument, but a cluster of claims that cluster around a central surprise. The self is not a monad, it is not a substance with an immutable essence. It is a nexus, a bundle, a weave of perceptions, sensations, memories, imaginings, emotions, that succeed one another and are held together not by a hidden soul but by regularities of association, habit, and remembrance. The unity we naturally ascribe to a person emerges from the way these perceptions are connected in time, in space, in causation, and in the practical concerns that guide action. And because these connections are what make life intelligible as a single life, we experience a continuity that feels like identity, even if there is no fixed core that remains unchanged. Now, let us turn to two essential areas. The first is the practical continuity of identity across the day, through shifts in mood, perception, and content. The second is the dream-wake boundary and the fragility of memory in preserving a sense of a single self. These two examples crystallize the bundle view in lived experience, not merely in abstract theory. The first example is continuity across a day of changing moods and perceptual content. Imagine a person who begins the morning with one mood, calm and curious, while the body is aware of light, the sounds of a neighborhood, the taste of coffee, and the memory of yesterday's conversation. As the day unfolds, that same person moves through anger at a missed deadline, then a sudden spark of encouragement from a friend, followed by a quiet sense of grief at a lost opportunity. Perceptions shift. The color of the sky in the afternoon, the texture of the chair under the body, the smell of rain, the memory of a childhood street, a line of a song that reappears in memory, a fleeting image from a recent dream. The bundle is crowded with contents that would not be identical from moment to moment: a perception of warmth or cold, a perception of social rejection or approval, a memory that connects with a past self, an imaginative scene that looks forward to a hoped-for future. These are not the same neuromachines ticking away in parallel. They are a stream whose elements are linked by causal and temporal continuity, by habitual sequences of thought, and by the surrounding life that gives them meaning. From Hume's vantage, the continuity we experience, the sense that I am the same person who had breakfast, who walked to the office, who chatted with a colleague about a problem, who felt a sting of disappointment, who then laughed at a joke, arises not from a metaphysical bridge but from the mind's propensity to connect one perception with the next by memory, habit, and association. The memory is not a perfect archivist of the past, but a selective, reconstructive system that tends to stitch together relevant moments into a coherent narrative. The imagination then fills gaps, suggests possibilities, and keeps the thread from snapping. The moral is not that there is a stubborn core of identity beneath appearances, but that the social, practical, and psychological demands of living with others create a felt continuity strong enough to sustain responsibility, affection, and trust. The bundle, in other words, is uninterrupted enough for all the ordinary purposes that matter in human life, even if it is not ontologically what it appears at first glance. Here we cross a border into a more charged part of the discussion: how the bundle theory deals with the most intimate form of continuity, memory itself. Memory, in Hume's account, is not a flawless photograph of the past, but a living, working mechanism that selects, reconstructs, and reinterprets. The present acts upon the past, and the past acts upon the present through the arc of memory. Yet memory is notoriously fallible. We misremember details, we import present concerns into past recollections. We confabulate stories that would make sense of our current situation. The mind, in its capacity to remember, does not preserve the past in a perfectly faithful way. It preserves a practical past, an inventory of relevant episodes that allow us to act and to narrate a life to ourselves and to others. The continuity of identity, therefore, is a function of how well the remembered past coheres with the present, and how reliably the past and present can be connected by a chain of perceptions and actions. To illuminate memory's role in the bundle, consider a concrete scenario many readers will recognize. Suppose you had a day when you woke with a sense of buoyant optimism. The morning's coffee tastes just right, the commute is smooth, and a friendly conversation lightens your mood. Then, as noon arrives, you find yourself suddenly remembering a failure from years ago, and you feel a sting of old regret, the perception of regret, the physical sensation of tension in the shoulders, the mental replay of a past scene. In the bundle theory, these moods and memories are not separate from one another. They belong to the same stream. Your sense of self at that moment is the reader of the narrative assembled from the day's perceptions, with memory providing the continuity by tying the current moment to earlier segments of the stream. If later in the afternoon, a person asks you what you did today, and you recount a continuous story that ties early morning sensations to late afternoon reflections, you are performing a memory-constructed identity. The narrative you tell, with its causal links, its episodes of choice, its emotional tone, is the identity that matters for living, for trust, for accountability. The second example, dreaming, sharpens the tension in the bundle view by highlighting memory's fragility and the dream-wake boundary. In a dream, you inhabit a self that acts as if it has coherence, intention, and memory, even though the dream content is often wildly inconsistent with your waking life. You might walk through a familiar street that, upon waking, is discovered to be altered or impossible. You might experience a recurring theme or identity within the dream, an ego that matters within the dream world but dissolves when you return to waking perception. The critical observation is that in dream life, the sense of continuity feels as real as in waking life. Yet when you wake, you discover that the dream self has no robust claim to persisting identity across the waking period. Memory is the hinge that holds waking life and dream life together. You may remember elements of the dream, you may not. You may remember only a fragment, or you may remember a coherent dream narrative that then evaporates upon daylight. The dream problem, in Hume's framework, reveals the mind's tendency to construct unity from disparate perceptual fragments, and it underscores that what we call the self is an interpretive synthesis rather than a metaphysical given. A crucial counterpoint that emerges from the dream and memory cases is the most stubborn challenge to Hume's bundle. The common sense claim, the social stability argument, that there is a continuous self that endures for purposes of responsibility, trust, and moral and legal coherence. If there is no persistent self, how do we hold someone morally accountable for actions performed in the past, or for commitments made yesterday, or for promises uttered a decade ago? The social world acts as if there is a single agent who carries forward intentions and obligations across time. Courts adjudicate on the basis that a person can be reliably identified over time. Families forgive, rehire, and remarry based on a presumed continuity of personhood. Friendships survive across years because we assume a single autobiographical center beneath the changing contents of consciousness. Hume is acutely aware that his theory unsettles these ordinary practices. The question then becomes whether the bundle theory can accommodate moral responsibility without appealing to an ontological soul. In his later writings, and particularly in the Inquiry, he gestures toward the social and practical imputation of character, habits of thought, and the expectation that others treat us as if we were stable persons. The result is not a reckless dissolution of responsibility, but a recalibration. We ground responsibility in the continuity of character and the public calculations of trust, rather than in a metaphysical substance that remains constant beneath appearances. Let us widen the horizon by recalling the philosophical landscape in which Hume was working. The Scottish Enlightenment was a lively network of thinkers asking how the human mind works, how the passions shape judgment, and how social order arises from the workings of perception, habit, and language. The broader atmosphere gathered in polite salons, in the coffee houses of Edinburgh, in the lectures at university towns, fed a robust interest in psychology and cognitive experience. Hume belonged to a circle that included not only himself but friends and neighbors who would become central figures in moral philosophy and political economy. Adam Smith, who wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments and later The Wealth of Nations. Thomas Reid, who would later become the spokesman for common sense, and the other thinkers who explored the empirical roots of belief, memory, and self-consciousness. The anecdote is that the Scottish Enlightenment did not merely admire the elegant argument, but cultivated a habit of testing ideas against lived experience, against the obviousness of common sense, and against the relentless reports of perception. Hume's bundle theory can be seen as a product of that intellectual climate, a bold, empirical attempt to explain how identity arises not from a hidden essence but from the disciplined recording of perceptual events, connected by memory, habit, and social practice. The reception of Hume's bundle theory in later debates about personal identity was anything but a straight line. The common sense tradition, led by figures like Thomas Reid, pushed back with a robust claim. There is a self that persists, and to deny it is to undermine the very basis of knowledge about one another. Reid's position, often summarized as a defense of common sense, challenges Hume by insisting that the most natural and indispensable belief, namely, that I am the same person who speaks and acts across time, has a warrant that cannot be dismissed as mere illusion or narrative convenience. The famous rhetorical move, if a man cannot remember his past actions, is he still the same man, is meant to draw attention to the practical gravity of personal identity. The debate spilled into later centuries, with Kant offering a different turn. Kant does not accept the bundle thesis as a complete account of selfhood. Rather, he introduces the idea of the unity of consciousness, the transcendental unity of apperception, as a constructive feature of experience. In Kant, there is a claim that the mind must synthesize appearances into a coherent field under a single subject, otherwise experience would be chaotic. This is a different way of explaining unity, one that preserves a kind of subjectivity that pre-exists and organizes perception, even as perceptions themselves come and go. In the modern era, two strands of thought repeatedly return to the self as narrative motif, but with different emphases. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, especially in Consciousness Explained, argues that the self is a center of narrative gravity, a design that our cognitive architecture uses to coordinate action, plan, and justify behavior. The self is not a thing but a function, a useful fiction, a construction of the brain designed to make sense of its own states for the purposes of decision-making and social life. Dennett's project in dialogue with Hume is to explain how we can have a robust sense of identity without requiring a stubborn metaphysical essence. Then there is Derek Parfit, whose Reasons and Persons offers perhaps the most rigorous contemporary articulation of the continuity and connectedness that matter for identity. Parfit discounts the persistence of a single subject in favor of psychological continuity and connectedness, arguing that what matters for survival is not a soul or a self, but the uninterrupted chain of connected experiences, memories, intentions, and character traits that would matter to a future version of oneself. Parfit's view pushes the bundle theory into a more radical plane. The self becomes a pattern of mental life, a structure of continuity that makes survival intelligible even when the ontology of a self evaporates. Kant and the modern analytic philosophers provide a conversation that is both corrective and complementary to Hume. Kant's unity of consciousness insists that there is a necessary substrate that makes experience possible, a subject that is the same across all appearances. Hume's bundle theory, by contrast, tends to erase or dissolve that substrate, showing how much of our sense of self arises from the mind's normal functioning: memory, anticipation, the coherence furnished by habit, and the social scripts that guide our lives. Yet Kant's insistence on a form of unity, though not a fixed self, keeps open the possibility that some structure of subjectivity is indispensable to experience. This remains a live dispute. The contemporary discussions in philosophy of mind and psychology, including the work of memory researchers and cognitive scientists, feed back into this debate. The question then becomes, to what extent can a purely empirical, narrative, or functional account of the self capture what matters for moral agency, responsibility, and the felt integrity of a life? If we return to the two concrete examples with these broader horizons in view, we can see how a modern audience might interpret Hume's claim in a way that is both accessible and deeply challenging. The first example, the continuity of identity across a day of changing moods, illustrates how identity can be stable not because a substance endures, but because a network of intentional states, memories, and social actions maintains a coherent story. Consider a person who starts the day with a calm self, experiences a momentary irritation in traffic, then a generous impulse that leads to helping a stranger, and later a fatigue that makes a joke fall flat. The bundle contains this reservoir of moods, perceptions, and intentions, and the eye of the day is the narrator who weaves those episodes into a single day's biography. If you asked, are you the same person at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., the sensible answer within the bundle view would be yes, because the series of perceptions and actions, joined by memory, expectation, and social identity, provides enough continuity for practical life and social trust. If someone looked for an unbroken metaphysical core, they would search in vain. The truth is more modest and more immediately relevant to everyday life. The second example, the dream-wake boundary and the fallibility of memory in maintaining a sense of a single self, puts pressure on any theory of identity that relies on a simple memory chain. In a dream, you inhabit a plausible self that acts and makes decisions, but on waking, you discover that those actions did not occur in the actual world, or that your memory of those events does not align with waking life. The dream self can feel urgent, responsible, even moral in the dream, yet upon waking, you realize that you are fundamentally different from that dream self in crucial respects. The dream problem unveils the fragility of memory as a guarantor of persistence. The bundle theory, however, does not promise a guarantee. Rather, it offers a functioning mechanism by which we navigate life with a sense of continuity even when memory misleads or content is radically altered. The narrative that emerges is not a stubborn coherence of a fixed self, but a cautiously robust coherence that allows for revision, self-critique, and the sometimes corrective power of reflection. Let us now turn to several lines of argument and counterargument that animate the debate. We need not pretend that it is merely a quaint puzzle. The bundle theory touches on the deepest questions about what you owe to yourself and to others, about how to interpret guilt and praise, about what the word I means when you consider actions across a long life. The first counterargument is the challenge from common sense and social stability. There seems to be a persistent self, and our ordinary practices, contracting, loving, forgiving, punishing, and praising, presuppose that the same person performs those actions across time. The burden on Hume is to show that the social world can function without assuming a metaphysical substance that persists. The burden is to show that accountability does not require a soul. In defending the bundle, we might appeal to a practical conception of responsibility. Responsibility is tied to evidence, to the intentions that are discernible in the public theater of conduct, to the capacity for rational judgment that can be tested against the agent's past acts, and to the expectations that others rely on in coordinating social life. The second counterargument concerns the sufficiency of a bundle to ground moral responsibility. Can a mere bundle of perceptions, without a persisting agent, sustain moral praise or blame across time? If there is no enduring self to hold responsible, what gives weight to the ideas of moral obligation, guilt for misdeeds, or gratitude for virtuous acts that occur years apart? Jeremiah-like in its demand, this problem requires a robust answer. Hume would respond by reframing moral responsibility in terms of character, habit, and the social construction of accountability, rather than deriving it from a compact metaphysical soul. The moral life for Hume is sustained by the reliability and predictability of a person's patterns of behavior, guided by the sentiments that emerge from sympathy and the social norms that shape action. In this view, freedom and responsibility are not fantasies of a persistent self, but practical commitments that survive by virtue of continued coherence, correction, and social trust. We should also be clear about cross-references to other lines of thought. Memory continuity is central to both the bundle view and its critics. The memory that binds episodes in a person's life is not a perfect ledger, but a selective, reconstructive process. The soul versus no soul debates pose a thorny background to this conversation. If one believes in a soul that anchors identity, Hume's theory might seem to threaten something essential. Yet some argue that memory and the sense of self could be grounded in a non-metaphysical substrate, organizational patterns of the brain, narrative structures produced by language and culture, without invoking a soul. The later analytic tradition, especially Parfit's arguments about psychological connectedness and continuity, can be read as a refined version of the bundle idea, focusing on the relations among mental states rather than the metaphysical status of a self. Dennett's account complements this by insisting that the self is a narrative center that becomes a kind of hypothesis we defend in real time for the sake of action and social cooperation. Kant's notion of the transcendental unity of apperception remains a crucial counterweight. Even if the bundle explains much of life's continuity, there remains a need for a unifying subject that makes experience intelligible in terms of a single, if perhaps not metaphysically solid, standpoint. To deepen the historical texture, we should insert two or more anecdotes that illuminate the section. Here are two that anchor the discussion in lived history. First, the broader Scottish Enlightenment's interest in psychology and cognitive experience. In the mid-18th century, Edinburgh and Glasgow were buzzing with questions about how minds work, how memory stores, how association governs thought, how perception shapes belief. Hume became a central voice in a culture that valued experimental reasoning about the human mind. He moved among people who asked how the passions drive belief, how habit creates expectation, and how language codifies the patterns of thought. This was not a sterile laboratory tradition, but a living culture in which the study of the mind overlapped with moral philosophy, economics, and political theory. Hume's bundle theory resonated with a practical sensibility. If thoughts and actions arise from a flowing stream of experiences, then it is the coherence of that stream, its patterns, its habits, its social receipts, that matters most, not any supposed fixed essence. The anecdote is not merely about ideas, but about a milieu in which an empirical psychology could be proposed, tested, and debated with seriousness and wit. Second, the reception of Hume's bundle theory in later debates about personal identity. The common-sense reaction, there is a self in everyday life, persisted into the next generation and beyond. Reid's critique of Hume offers a vivid counterpoint. If the mind is a theater of perceptions, how can one explain the persistent center of experience that organizes every perception into a life? The discussion extended into the philosophy of mind and even into political philosophy, where the question of identity becomes entangled with responsibility and rights. The 19th and 20th centuries saw new stakes attached to the problem, as philosophers and scientists tried to reconcile continuity with the mutable content of experience. The later revival of the problem by thinkers like Parfit and Dennett, each proposing a different mechanism for survival, shows how Hume's radical doubt about a fixed self remains a provocative point of departure. And within this revival, Hume's own words, his attention to perception, memory, and narrative, continue to provide a necessary point of reference, a reminder that the self we live with is less a thing to be found and more a story to be told, revised, and shared. We should also bring in quotes from primary sources to ground the discussion in the texture of Hume's own voice, and to show how this voice has shaped centuries of thought. In the treatise, Hume writes with that precise, almost surgical clarity that makes his claims both compelling and elusive. When he says, "I never can observe anything but the perception," we hear a methodological injunction. To study the self, we must attend to what is presented to the senses and what memory and imagination do with that material. He goes on to describe the mind as a theater, where perceptions which enter and pass and present themselves speak and are heard. And then the central maxim, often rendered as the bundle claim, appears with even greater force in common paraphrase. The identity of the mind is a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other and are in a perpetual flux and movement. It is not a fatalistic claim about the impossibility of persistence, but a claim about where persistence comes from. The mind's preference for connecting perceptions through habit, memory, and association, and the social practice of calling these connections a person. In the inquiry, Hume's tone shifts from the technical to the practical, from the laboratory of the treatise to the questions of common life. He remains consistent in the thrust of his critique. Belief in the self as something stable is a product of habit and the mind's propensity to unify experience for practical ends. The inquiry helps us to see that the bundle view is not a rejection of personal importance, but a redescription of what personal importance is, a matter of narrative coherence rather than metaphysical essence. If you want to test your own intuitions, try the following thought experiment. Imagine a continuous stream of perceptions, bodily sensations, social encounters, memories, fantasies. Suppose you could observe this stream with perfect objectivity and were allowed to remove any one perception at a time. You would still have the rest of the stream, a continuing flow, a living process. The self would be preserved as long as enough of the stream remains connected by causation and memory to present you to yourself as the same subject. Now subtract the entire memory bank, the place where past perceptions are held together, and the stream would fragment into a series of disconnected fragments. The sense of a single, persistent you would fade away. This exercise underscores a crucial point. Memory is not an ornament to identity, but its scaffolding. Cross-referencing to related lines of thought can deepen the sense of continuity across time and disciplines. Memory continuity, for instance, is not merely a psychological matter. It intersects with debates about the soul, about whether a soul can survive memory loss, and about what it means for an actor to be the same person across different lives. The soul versus no soul debates emerge in religious and philosophical contexts. If the soul is the enduring bearer of identity, then memory might be a secondary feature or a mere relic of the soul's continued presence. But if there is no soul, then memory and perception must carry identity forward by other means, by narrative coherence, by social practice, by the forms of life we led. Yet the analytic tradition, especially in Parfit, still uses the language of continuity and connectedness to describe survival, even while reserving judgment on whether there is a self as such. The memory of a past action becomes a route through which future actions can be expected to align with a certain course of character. In this sense, memory continuity is not simply a psychological phenomenon. It is the ethical infrastructure that makes responsibility possible in a world where the self is not a fixed substance. As we approach a close to this segment, let me offer a few concluding reflections on the practical significance of Hume's bundle theory for our understanding of life, law, and moral life. The bundle view challenges us to examine how identity is used in the ordinary grammar of responsibility. If the self is not a thing but a pattern, then punishment and praise must be tied to that pattern rather than to a metaphysical soul. It invites a kind of humility about our claims to know others' inner lives and about our own self-knowledge. It invites us to ask, what kinds of memory and narrative would we like to preserve about ourselves? What are the habits and practices that help keep our lives coherent and meaningful from one day to the next? And what are the risks if we overinterpret continuity, if we mistake a robust memory for a fixed essence? In the broader arc of philosophy, Hume's self as bundle theory is not a closing statement but a provocation that continues to echo in later debates. It invites us to examine how the unity of consciousness is achieved in experience, not by fiat of a soul, but by the dynamic processes of perception, imagination, and memory. Kant's transcendental unity offers one answer to how experience remains intelligible under a single standpoint, while Dennett and Parfit offer other ways of understanding how survival and identity can be meaningful even without a traditional, metaphysical self. The Scottish Enlightenment itself, with its emphasis on empirical psychology and the social sources of belief, provides a historical background in which such questions could be asked with urgency and seriousness. Hume's own voice, quiet, exact, often amused at his own paradoxes, remains a living guide in this conversation. He does not surrender the importance of selfhood, he reframes it. The self is the coherent narrative produced by a continually updating bundle of perceptions, and the moral life proceeds through the careful maintenance of the relations that make that narrative workable. As we prepare to move forward, we outline a plan for further expansion that would deepen the discussion to about 5,000 words, if we were to conduct a longer exploration. We would devote a section to the bundle in practice, examining in greater detail how everyday life embodies a bundle-like identity through memory, habit, and social practice. We would then treat memory and identity more thoroughly, tracing the mechanisms by which memory ties together life chapters and how false memories or memory gaps influence the sense of self. The dream problem would receive a focused treatment, comparing dream life to waking life in various cultures and psychological theories of dreaming to illustrate the fragility and resilience of the self's coherence. Against the notion of a pure self would be a longer, more rigorous defense of the bundle view, addressing further objections and exploring how moral responsibility can be grounded in the stability of character and the social context rather than in a metaphysical soul. Finally, intersections with free will and moral responsibility would consider how the bundle view intersects with debates about autonomy, agency, and accountability, including case studies from legal philosophy and everyday moral life. Throughout, we would maintain cross-references to memory continuity, the soul versus no-soul debates, and the later analytic reconstructions of personal identity. We would add more historical anecdotes, for instance, specific moments in Hume's life and correspondence that reveal his own introspective experiments with memory and perception, or a closer account of how Reid responded to Hume in print and in lectures, and how Kant's own lectures treated the unity of experience as a necessary condition for knowledge. We would incorporate more primary source quotes from the treatise and the inquiry, as well as careful references to Parfit's reasons and persons and Dennett's consciousness explained, presented as interpretive interactions rather than as simple summaries. And we would tie these threads to practical examples from law, education, medicine, and everyday social life, how we recognize people across time, how memory shapes testimony, how social stability depends on a tacit agreement about a shared, if not essential, self. If you are listening now, take a breath and consider the intimacy of the question. The self is our most intimate instrument, how we plan, how we forgive, how we imagine the future. Hume asks us to attend to the stream of perception well enough to see how easily a tidy story of a single person can be manufactured from a jumble of sensations and thoughts. He asks us to examine memory's limits, to notice how dreams can imitate life's form, and to recognize the social and moral demands that require a stable sense of self, even when the deepest metaphysical assumptions about that self are unsettled. He invites us to a patient, reflective engagement with the most personal topic a thinker can address. And so, in the spirit of Snooze philosophy, we end where we began, with quiet attention, with the sense that every hour of life is a stitching together of moments into a larger pattern, and with the invitation to dwell in the space between perception and memory, where the self arises not as an object to be found, but as a living practice to be sustained. The bundle, then, is not a cold abstraction. It is a lived framework that enables us to act, to love, to remember, and to grow. It is the mind's craft of identity, assembled from perception after perception, and told forward by the ever-renewing act of telling. In the echoes of Hume's own voice, we hear a final note. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. The invitation is not to abandon the life of selfhood, but to understand it more patiently, as a dynamic, narrative achievement born out of the flux of experience. The self in this light is not a fossil but a living manuscript, an ongoing composition in which memory and imagination, habit and social trust, give shape to a life that continues from day to day. And that perhaps is what makes the bundle theory not only a philosophical critique but a humane one. It asks us to recognize the fragility and resilience of the life we led, and to cultivate a form of self-understanding that is honest about its own foundations while generous in its implications for how we treat one another in time. Imagine settling into a warm, quiet room where the hum of the city beyond the window recedes and the focus rests on two small but mighty questions. What do we mean when we say something is right or wrong, and where do those judgments arise if not from the pure daylight of reason alone? In this section, we walk with David Hume into the heart of moral psychology, the idea that our judgments of virtue and vice spring from sentiment, from sympathy, from the imagined lives of others, rather than from syllogisms and abstract principle. We'll trace how moral approval is kindled by benevolence and by the sense of how our actions would affect others, and how those feelings bind communities through shared norms and conventions. We'll also measure how Hume's thought sits beside, challenges, and interacts with the larger currents of the Scottish Enlightenment, bringing us to conversations with Adam Smith, with Kant, and with utilitarian hopefuls who would come after. And we'll look to the living puzzles of today, how contemporary psychology, political economy, and moral pluralism still echo these early debates. The language of sentiment opens the door. When Hume speaks of sentiment, he is not merely naming a mood, he is naming the ground from which we judge, praise, blame, and reward. Sentiment, in his sense, carries with it a social function. It is the capacity to feel with others, to imagine their happiness or misery, and to respond with approbation or disapprobation. It is this felt response, this sympathetic resonance, that gives rise to moral approval. Consider for a moment how a mother might recoil at cruelty toward her child, not by a calculation of rules, but by an instantaneous, intimate sense that such treatment wounds another in a way that matters to us. The same mechanism underwrites admiration for acts of generosity, not because we have computed the utility of benevolence in a vacuum, but because we have felt ourselves into the experiences of others and found those experiences commendable. Hume's insight, often summarized in the provocative line that has echoed through centuries, is that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. Reason can tell us what would follow from our chosen actions or how things are, but it does not itself command the moral verdict. The verdict arises first in the theater of feeling, and reason may then rearrange, articulate, or defend that verdict. In Hume's account, to judge an action as virtuous is to approve it, an approval that arises out of the fellow feeling we have with others. He does not deny that we can deliberate about consequences, about means and ends, about consistency and coherence. Rather, he insists that the ultimate standard is not an abstract maxim mastered by pure reason, but the shared sentiment of the community, tempered by imagination. When we consider someone who helps a stranger in distress, we envision the effects of that act on others, and we feel a positive excitation, some call it benevolence, toward the person who acts. When we witness cruelty, we feel a negative agitation, a recoil that signals disapproval. This is not a calculation about utility in a sterile sense. It is a vivid, social, emotionally freighted verdict about the character of an action. Two functions in Hume's moral psychology deserve particular emphasis as we listen to them with our modern ears. First is the social imagination, the capacity to put ourselves imaginatively into the situation of another. This is not mere sympathy as passive feeling. It is an active project of imagining causes, effects, and the pain or pleasure of others. Second is the mechanism of moral approval that follows from benevolence and the imagined impact of actions on others. When we see another person's happiness increase because we have acted justly or generously, we acquire a sense of moral satisfaction that confirms our sense of virtue. The pleasure of virtue is part of the psychology of moral life, not a collateral reward tacked on afterward. To be virtuous in this sense is to harmonize our sentiments with the welfare of others, and to recognize that such harmony yields the social goods we depend upon. Trust, cooperation, and stability, two concrete moral examples, illuminate this psychology in action. First, consider a scene of cruelty. A caregiver who shames, tortures, or neglects a child triggers a cascade of sympathetic responses in observers. People in the room experience a shared revulsion, a surge of pity for the child, and a collective endorsement of intervention. The moral verdict, this treatment is bad, this person is blameworthy, emerges from these feelings. It is not generated by a syllogism that proves cruelty is wrong by logical necessity. It is generated by the felt aversion to the harm done to a vulnerable life and the imagined future suffering that would stem from permitting cruelty to continue. The sentiment is reinforced by social cues, authorities' disapproval, witnesses' concern, the community's memory of harms. The judgment is thus embedded in a network of sympathy, social norms, and expectations about how we ought to protect the vulnerable. A more modern articulation of the same intuition might invoke moral emotions as cognitive scaffolds: empathy, indignation at injustice, or compassionate concern for the helpless, yet the grounding remains sentiment and imaginative engagement with others. Second, turn to acts of generosity. When a person steps forward to aid a stranger, a donation, a rescue, or a risk to their own safety for another's benefit, the observer often feels admiration and gratitude. The sentiment here is not merely the pleasure of watching someone do something good, it is the perception that the agent embodies a virtue that should be imitated. We imagine how the helper's generosity expands communal welfare, and we feel a sense of hope that societies built on such generosity will be more just and more stable. The moral approval is reinforced by social imagination. We picture the positive ripple effects in the lives of recipients, families, and communities, and we internalize a standard that benevolence is good. This sentiment is not easily reducible to a calculus of outcomes alone. It grows from the capacity to imagine another's well-being and to identify with it, a capacity that makes morality, in Hume's telling, a social and emotional achievement, not merely a cognitive deduction. The is-ought problem in action lies at the heart of the ethical drama. Hume insists that facts about human nature, the way people actually feel, react, and imagine, do not, by themselves, entail normative conclusions about how people ought to act. This is the famous is-ought gap. To show how that gap operates, consider two scenarios that surface the problem in stark relief. First scenario, suppose we describe a society where people naturally enjoy personal gain at the expense of others, and where the distribution of wealth is heavily skewed toward the powerful. A philosopher who analyzes these facts might conclude, descriptively, that people in this society are self-interested, or that property norms have become entrenched. Yet from these factual observations alone, one cannot derive a moral prescription that says, therefore, you ought to permit exploitation, or therefore, you ought to rearrange property rights. The policy conclusion depends on a normative standard, what counts as justice. What kind of social arrangement ought to exist, which cannot be deduced from the mere data about human psychology and economic arrangement. The is here does not automatically yield the ought. Second scenario, we can imagine two possible worlds, each with different constellations of sentiment. In one world, acts of generosity produce universal happiness. In another, the same acts yield little net benefit or even produce resentment. If we simply describe the sentiments people hold, we still have not settled which world should be preferred. The normative conclusion, how we ought to structure moral rules, laws, or institutions, depends on a standard beyond mere description of sentiments. Hume's point is that moral life is anchored in sentiment, but moral rules emerge through social practices, conventions, and agreements that prescribe how sentiments ought to be aligned with the common good. The challenge is that the normative standard is not a simple logical consequence of factual statements. It is a product of effective responses in a social context. To see how these moves connect with historical voices, we must cross to the living tradition that includes Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments. Smith's work is a consistent companion to the Humean project. He writes, how selfish soever man may be, there is something within him that is greater than his selfishness. There is a tenderness within human nature, he argues, that seeks approbation from others, and that delights in the approval of the impartial spectator who stands outside the moment to judge actions with a broader social perspective. The theory of moral sentiments elaborates a psychology of sympathy, a social imagination, and a sense of justice that is bound up in the life of the community. The moral life in Smith is not a cold calculus but a social drama in which individuals modulate their conduct to fit the moral sentiments of others. Smith's sympathy is thus a practical instrument for social cooperation, an instrument that echoes Hume's claim that moral life is rooted in sentiment and imagination. When we turn to the dialogue with Kant and the utilitarian horizon, the tension becomes sharper. Kant insists that morality rests on universal maxims that can be willed as a law for all rational beings. The categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, offers a deontological framework that claims normative force independent of sentiment. In contrast, Humean sentimentality emphasizes the social, contingent, and effective foundations of moral life. Utilitarian thinkers, following Bentham's oft-repeated line that the aim is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, attempt to translate the moral life into the calculus of utility, seeking to maximize the sum of welfare across sentient beings. The two lines of thought, Kantian deontology and Benthamian utilitarianism, often press against Hume's sentimentalism because they claim that normative obligation can be derived from a rational or teleological structure that transcends contingent sentiments. Yet many modern interpreters insist that the social value of morality remains inextricably tied to our sentiments and their social function. The question then becomes not which origin is ultimate, but how sentiment, reason, and utility co-create our sense of obligation in concrete institutions and practices. Two robust counterarguments to Humean sentimentalism deserve careful attention. The first is the objection from moral realism. There exist robust, mind-independent moral facts that do not depend on sentiment for their truth. Cruelty toward innocents might be described as wrong in various ways regardless of how many people feel about it, and some moral realists would insist that the wrongness is a feature of the world, not a felt phenomenon. Realists might point to cases of moral progress, abolition of slavery, condemnation of genocide, universal rights, that seem to outstrip the temper of any single culture or sentiment, suggesting there is a normative core to morality that transcends local feelings. The Humean counter is not to deny progress, but to insist that the motive power for progress, the energy that pushes people to criticize cruelty or to aspire to justice, originates in sentiment and social imagination. Realists can agree that moral sentiment exists and has explanatory force. They will contest the claim that sentiment is the sole or primary source of moral obligation. The dialogue then becomes a conversation about how much of morality is grounded in human nature's propensities, and how much can be discovered through rational reflection on those propensities in the light of universalizable standards. The second counterargument invokes cultural relativism and skeptical challenges to cross-cultural agreement. If moral judgments vary substantially across societies, how can we claim any universal moral standard? Hume's account allows for variation because sentiment and social conventions adapt to local histories and institutions. Yet the critic can insist that the very possibility of criticizing another culture's practices, slavery, oppression, or gender injustice in some contexts, requires a standard that transcends cultural norms. If moral judgments are entirely relative to custom, then moral critique becomes hollow, or at least becomes an exercise in power rather than truth. The Humean may respond by arguing that while customs differ, there are universal human features, sympathy, affection for kin or community, concern for welfare, that give rise to cross-cultural overlap in judgments about cruelty, fairness, and welfare. The modern version of this defense can be found in the moral psychology program that seeks to explain common moral foundations across cultures while also acknowledging genuine variation. The key question remains: can sentiment as a social mechanism yield a robust, cross-cultural normative theory, or must we supplement it with an additional, perhaps rational, scaffold? Two historical anecdotes illuminate the conversation in more living terms. The first concerns Hume in the orbit of the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume's circle, Ferguson, Kames, Smith, and others, lived in a culture that prized skeptical inquiry, empirical observation, and public debate about the origins and aims of social order. The Edinburgh conversations, the coffeehouse theaters of argument, the anonymous pamphlets on religion and commerce, all of this formed a climate in which moral psychology could flourish as a science of sentiment. Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion and his moral essays circulated in such spaces, and his insistence that moral distinctions are founded in sentiment was not a private doctrine but a public program. To understand morality as a human phenomenon anchored in social life, to see the polite arts as instruments for shaping and guiding feeling toward humane ends, and to view government as an instrument of utility that expresses, channels, and harmonizes those sentiments in shared institutions. The Scottish Enlightenment thus provided the soil in which Hume's moral psychology could take root, and his influence there seeded a generation of thinkers who took seriously the social imagination as the engine of moral life. The second anecdote concerns the reception and development of Hume's moral theory by contemporaries such as Smith and later philosophers who built on or reacted against him. Adam Smith's own project, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, can be read as a direct development of the sentiment-based psychology that Hume had helped to popularize. Smith's notion of the impartial spectator, the imagined observer who stands outside a situation and judges it with dispassionate fairness, echoes Hume's emphasis on sympathy disciplined by social perspective. The reception of Hume's ideas also rippled outward into the way moral philosophy would be constructed in subsequent centuries. Some later philosophers, like Kant, challenged the sufficiency of sentiment as a foundation for obligation, offering instead a universal law-governed framework. Others, like James Mill or Bentham, pressed toward a more explicit theory of utility and social welfare, building on the insight that social arrangements must promote happiness, but seeking to translate sentiment into a more explicit calculus of consequences. The history is not a straight line, but a conversation. Hume shapes Smith, Smith shapes Bentham, Kant challenges them all, and later 20th century moral psychology returns to the central insight that feeling and imagination are not optional auxiliaries of morality but its living core. Cross-references to themes in 18th century political economy, social contract theory, and the evolution of virtue ethics further illuminate the path. In political economy, the idea that social cooperation depends on shared norms and sentiment sits near the heart of Smith's Wealth of Nations, where economic life is inseparable from moral life. Commerce thrives where trust, sympathy, and a sense of fair dealing flourish. The social contract has a parallel in Hume's essays, where rather than a grand narrative of origin, he emphasizes utility and habit, the ways in which governments emerge from the need to restrain passions and secure the advantages of social life. The evolution of virtue ethics across these centuries can be seen as a shift from a focus on universal rules or teleological aims toward a more textured, nuanced picture in which virtuous character is cultivated through habit, sentiment, social practice, and institutional design. The virtues, as Hume and Smith describe them, are at once natural, rooted in our sociability and benevolence, and artificial, refined by the demands of justice, fidelity, property, and social trust. To connect Humean sentimentalism to modern life, we can draw lines to contemporary moral psychology and moral philosophy. The language of sympathy that once described fellow feeling now often takes refuge in terms like empathy, perspective-taking, and effective forecasting. The claim that moral judgments arise from sentiment coexists with empirical research showing that emotions shape moral reasoning in real time. The work of psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, for example, traces how moral intuitions and emotions influence judgments that people later rationalize in various ways. The cross-cultural dimension remains. While some moral intuitions are widely shared, others diverge across cultures, and debates about universal human rights versus cultural sovereignty continue to unfold. Modern interpreters, even when they depart from Hume, often return to his insight that moral life is deeply social and emotionally inhabited. The challenge in the current moment is to articulate how sentiment, social imagination, and reason can together guide public life, whether in education, criminal justice, or policy, without surrendering the complexity of human feeling to an abstract, universalist template. Two more points of connection anchor the discussion in the politics and philosophy of the 18th century. First, the idea that justice and fidelity are artificial virtues, virtues constructed by social convention and practice, behaves as a corrective to the temptation to treat virtue as a mere natural disposition. Hume's claim that justice is a product of social utility. Justice is not a natural virtue, but an artificial one in effect, helps explain why societies with similar material needs can nevertheless disagree about legal rules, property rights, and obligations of fidelity. The sense of obligation to honor a trust, to keep a promise, or to support the social contract arises from the imagined benefits to social stability rather than from some simple, automatic feeling of rightness. In Smith's hands, that structure of social obligation is precisely what allows the generous, cooperative life to flourish in a world of commerce and exchange. The reciprocity we feel toward others, built on sympathy and supported by institutions, makes possible a morally sensible economy, just as the economy in turn sustains the social bonds that enable virtue to be cultivated. Second, the history of the period invites us to see virtue ethics as more than a private matter of taste. The 18th century watched the slow emergence of debates about the nature of social authority, the legitimacy of government, and the moral purposes of law. The moral psychology that Hume invited into public debate intersected with early social contract theorists, early political economists, and early socio-political thinkers. This is not a mere historical curiosity. It is a signal that the shape of our moral beliefs rests not only on private sentiment, but on the public, shared life in which sentiment informs law, custom, and policy. If we read Hume with Smith, Kant, and Bentham in view, we glimpse a map of moral inquiry that is both descriptive, how moral life actually unfolds, and normative, how we might shape institutions to harmonize sentiment with justice and welfare. The practical applications of Humean moral psychology reach into the heart of institutions and daily life. In contemporary terms, the claim that moral judgments are rooted in sentiment supports arguments for education that cultivates empathy, perspective-taking, and social imagination. If benevolence, generosity, and the sense of social duty originate in the heart's response to others' welfare, then institutions, schools, courts, charitable organizations have a duty to cultivate environments in which those sentiments can develop and be refined. It also suggests that public discourse itself must consider the emotional as well as the rational. Arguments that appeal to concern for others' welfare, or that vividly imagine the consequences for vulnerable groups, may be more effective in aligning public opinion with just policy than arguments that appeal only to abstract principle. The critique of cruelty, the celebration of generosity, and the defense of social cooperation often hinge on the moral imagination, and thus on the sentiments that literature, art, and public speech can evoke. Two additional examples from the present illustrate the continued resonance of Hume's thought. First, debates over welfare policy and social safety nets often hinge on sentiment. People are moved by stories of hardship, and those emotional responses shape political opinions and policy proposals. The moral life is not just a ledger of benefits and costs. It is a narrative landscape in which sympathy for the vulnerable can become political impetus. Second, debates about justice and property, about taxation, redistribution, and social obligations reflect the tension between natural virtues and artificial virtues. Our modern economies require a delicate balance, generosity and mutual aid that arise from natural sociability, tempered by rules and institutions that preserve order and protect rights. Hume's framework helps us see why both dimensions matter and why the two must be reconciled in concrete policy and law. As we circle back to larger themes, a few cross-references deserve explicit attention. Hume's emphasis on sentiment and social imagination dovetails with Aristotle's virtue ethics in a provocative way. Both traditions acknowledge that character is formed by habituation, by the social environment, and by the cultivation of practical wisdom. But Hume contemporizes the conversation by insisting that the social emotions are not mere accelerants of a pre-existing virtue. They are themselves the primary material from which moral life is formed. Across the 18th century, moral psychology thus plays a central role in shaping political economy, social contract thinking, and the emergence of virtue ethics as a living practice rather than a static doctrine. The conversation continues into the modern era, where empirical studies of emotion and morality intersect with the legal and political reflections that emerged out of this period. To close this reflective walk, I offer a brief map of how this material could expand into a fuller treatment, an outline, if you will, for a longer, fuller exploration that would bring us toward a 5,000-word depth while preserving the calm, reflective tone that anchors Snooze philosophy. The language of sentiment, a deeper exploration of how sympathy operates, how the imagination engages with others' experiences, and how social imagination shapes moral norms. This would include more detailed case studies, historical anecdotes about the early development of sentimental psychology, and a careful examination of how language expresses sentiment in moral discourse, including the rhetoric of praise and blame, approval and disapproval, admiration and contempt. The is-ought problem in action, a sequence of thought experiments and real-world cases to illustrate precisely how factual descriptions of human nature do not entail normative conclusions. This section would broaden the scenarios, including conflicts between sentiment and legal obligations, or between communal welfare and individual rights. It would also include a close reading of Hume's own arguments, alongside contemporary discussions of moral realism and cross-cultural critique, and a careful look at how different normative theories, Kantian, utilitarian, and realism, resolve or reinterpret the is-ought gap. The social basis of morality, an in-depth treatment of how sympathy and sentiment interact with social conventions, institutions, and norms. This would examine the way justice and fidelity are formed as artificial virtues, the role of law, contract, and property in shaping moral life, and the dynamic between natural affections and the expectations of public life. It would also bring in more cross-references to Smith's theory of moral sentiments and to the broader Enlightenment debate about the social foundations of morality, the generative power of social networks, and the evolution of moral language. Justice as artificial virtue, a focused analysis of how the virtues of justice and fidelity depend on social convention and the utility they provide in maintaining stable communities. This would include historical anecdotes about the emergence of property rights, the formation of legal systems, and the negotiation of social trust. The discussion would compare Hume's view with other 18th century writers who treated law as a human artifact shaped by need, habit, and social pressure, and would connect to debates about civil government, political economy, and the moral psychology of obligation. Moral pluralism and cultural variation, an exploration of how different cultures articulate virtue, how moral judgments diverge, and what, if any, universal commitments endure. This section would incorporate more recent empirical studies in cross-cultural ethics and discuss how Humean sentiment remains a plausible account for many shared intuitions while remaining honest about divergent moral landscapes. It would consider how to build argument and policy in light of plural moral understandings, while still respecting shared human concerns for welfare, fairness, and harm avoidance. And woven through all of these sections would be sustained cross-references to Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, highlighting the shared emphasis on sympathy and social imagination, while also noting the distinctive paths taken by Kantian and utilitarian critics. It would also connect to 18th century political economy, social contract thought, and the evolution of virtue ethics as a living historical drama, from the Edinburgh salons to the lecture halls of modern philosophy and the policy debates of today. Two final reflections to carry with us. First, that morality is a living art of feeling anchored in social life, and second, that reason, however sharp and useful, often serves best when it accompanies the heart's best impulses for the common good. When we look at cruelty and generosity, when we weigh justice against convenience, and when we consider how communities train their members to respond to others' pain or need, we glimpse a moral ecology in which sentiment, imagination, and social convention co-create the standard by which we judge action. Hume invites us to listen to the subtle music of the social soul, the quiet harmonies of sympathy that, in the right conditions, compose the ethical life. To return to the words of our own time and to mark the path ahead for deeper study, we can close with a few signposts. Seek the primary texts, the treatise, the inquiry, the theory of moral sentiments, and the correspondence that links Hume, Smith, Kant, and Bentham in a single, turbulent conversation about what makes life livable in a community. Listen for the way sentiment and social imagination move through policy, education, and law. Observe how the is-ought problem remains a living challenge to any moral theory that would claim a purely rational foundation, while ignoring the felt life that sustains it. And remember the historical note. In the rooms of Edinburgh among the gales of the Scottish Enlightenment, a new sense of moral life took form, one that would be refined, contested, and reinterpreted for centuries to come, but whose heartbeat, the sympathy that binds us to others, continues to beat in every thoughtful act of justice, every quiet act of generosity, and every shared impulse toward a more humane world. In the end, Humean moral sentimentalism invites us to listen to the soft voices of benevolence and the urgent calls of compassion, to the imagined lives of others and the social web that holds us together. It asks us to see morality not as a dusty list of rules, but as a living practice of feeling, imagination, and virtue shaped by the communities we inhabit. And in that invitation, the conversation with Smith, Kant, and the long arc of ethical thought continues, inviting us to a richer understanding of what it means to be human in a shared world. Let us slow our pace and listen to the voice of a thinker who asks us to rest on the edge between everyday conviction and rigorous doubt. David Hume returns to the stage in this final section not as a mere debunker of religious doctrine, but as a careful assessor of how far our experience, our feelings, and our inferences can take us toward belief. He invites us to examine the scaffolding of natural religion, the attempt to infer a designer from the order and complexity we observe in the world, before we decide what it proves about the nature of the divine, if indeed there is one worth naming. He also takes up the stubborn habit of miracle testimony, and in doing so, he presses us to weigh the strength of ordinary evidence against the extraordinary claims that religion often demands. And through this, he does not merely undermine. He expands the space for understanding how religious life arises, how it persists, and how it can be interpreted within an empiricist framework that remains true to experience as the sole real teacher of the world. To begin, imagine the dialogues concerning natural religion as a living debate among characters who represent different temperaments and kinds of reasoning. You have Cleanthes, who speaks with the confidence of a craftsman, pressing the analogy between human design and the vast order of the cosmos. Cleanthes says in effect that the world has the marks of a design, a wise and benevolent designer, and that the best guide we have to understanding that designer is the goodness of the effects we can observe in the natural world. Then there is Philo, the skeptic among them, who plays the role of the devil's advocate inside the religious conscience. Philo pushes back against the leap from effects to a single intelligent cause, from a veil of order to a fully transparent theism about the nature of that designer. And then there is Denis, who represents a deeper, more interior, less apparently rational piety. The appeal here is to felt experience, to a kind of spiritual temperament that resists being tested by the dry method of evidence alone. The dialogue does not pretend to settle anything for us in a neat theorem. It stages the tension between seeing a pattern in nature and asking what would be required to turn that pattern into certainty about God's nature, about God's existence, or about God's benevolence. From the vantage point of empirical skepticism, what Hume highlights in the dialogues is not simply a quarrel about whether there is evidence for God. The core question is whether the evidence we possess about design in nature suffices to warrant the inferences that religious tradition asks of us. Cleanthes, with his clockmaker analogy, insists that the world's order resembles human design closely enough to justify concluding that there is an intelligent designer behind it. The metaphor is powerful because it leverages the reader's familiarity with human artifacts. We see gears, wheels, regularity, purpose. It is hard to resist thinking there must have been an artisan. Yet Hume, through Philo's probing voice, urges us to attend to two things that often go ignored in popular versions of the teleological argument. First, our inference from design rests on an analogy between human-made order and cosmic order that may be a weak bridge across vast ontological difference. Second, the possibility remains that even if order implies an author, the author could be nothing like the God described by Orthodox religion. The author could be, at least, a being with power and a temperament not dissimilar to a human designer, but with motives we cannot know, or with a structure of reality so different that our comparison becomes suspect. In this dialogue, the problem of inference becomes clear. The analogy is powerful, yes, but it is just that, an analogy. An analogy can illuminate, but it does not certify what lies beyond the boundary of experience. Hume's Philo asks, if the world is like a machine, what does this tell us about the maker? Does it reveal benevolence, justice, omnipotence, or something else entirely? And crucially, is the argument from design a proof that supports a specific doctrine about the nature of God, or is it merely an inference about the existence of some kind of intelligent agent who set things up? The dialogue thus becomes a meditation on the limits of inference from effects to causes, from the visible order of things to the hidden will behind them. From this vantage point, two concrete realizations emerge that are easy to overlook in more confident accounts of natural theology. First, the teleological argument, for all its apparent strength, is built on the presumption that regularity in nature is best explained by agency rather than by blind necessity. The alternative we must consider, however, is that regularity might arise from necessity or from some lawful principle that does not require a designer with intentional goals. In modern terms, one can imagine a universe governed by elegant mathematical laws that do not entail a benevolent designer who cares for human outcomes. The teleology argument thus encounters its own internal tension. It seeks to deduce a benevolent designer from order, while order itself could be a reflection of impersonal law rather than of personality. Second, the everyday religious sentiment, the sense of moral life, community, shared ritual, and reverence that suffuses many people's experience is not easily captured by the mere existence of natural order. Hume emphasizes that the very social and moral aspects of religion, the consolations people find in belief, the sense of belonging to a community, the experience of virtue, the hope for justice, may be natural products of human nature under social conditions, rather than rational proofs of a divine nature. The moral and communal dimensions are not simply side effects of belief. They may be central to why belief persists and how it functions in ordinary life. If we are attentively honest, these sentiments are as much a part of religious life as any metaphysical argument. They arise from sympathy, imagination, and the social instincts that bind a community together. Hume's empiricist sensibility does not deny these phenomena. It asks us to distinguish their social and psychological roots from their claims about metaphysical reality. Turning from the dialogical theater of natural religion to the more explicit target of his critique of miracles, we enter a different arena, the arena of testimony and evidential strength. Hume's starting point is simple and, in its method, relentlessly rigorous. He asks us to consider miracles not as rare occasional wonders, but as events that contravene the known laws of nature. What must be true for testimony about miracles to tilt belief toward their reality? The answer, he argues, is not merely that miracles happen, but that the testimony surrounding them is strong enough to overcome the preponderant probability that ordinary natural events occur as expected. And here he offers one of the most famous lines in the history of philosophy of religion. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact. What does that sentence test? It tests the Bayesian logic embedded in religious belief long before Bayesian calculus was formalized. If the background probability of natural regularity is high, and a miracle would be highly unlikely under that background, then the testimony must be extraordinarily strong to justify belief in the miracle. Hume's point sharpened is not merely that miracles are improbable, it is that this improbability, when weighed against the likelihood of deception, mistake, or miscommunication, tends to tilt the scale away from miraculous claims unless the testimonial chain is exceptionally robust. In plain terms, a narrative of a miracle would have to survive not only one witness, but a cascade of corroboration that could invalidate ordinary human frailty, credulity, error, wishful thinking, the possibility of hoax. Without such extraordinary testimonial fortification, the standard conclusion is that miracle claims are not credible. This line of argument has moral and epistemic consequences that reverberate through religious life. If testimony is inherently weak, then religious belief derived from miracles rests on a fragile epistemic foundation. It does not, at least for Hume, offer the kind of rational certainty that would permit metaphysical claims about the nature of God, divine omniscience, or the eternal order. The burden of proof for miracles shifts from the miracle itself to the reliability of our sources, and the overall probability calculus of the case moves toward skepticism unless extraordinary conditions prevail. The result for Hume is a broader skepticism about the capacity of experience to justify a robust theism. The religious imagination may still flourish, but the claim that experience itself offers rational proof of God's designs or intervention is unsettled. If we try to summarize the two standpoints side by side, we can see a pattern. The natural theology argument, deriving a designer from design, depends upon analogies and inferences. The miracle argument depends upon testimony and probabilistic reasoning about the reliability of witnesses. In both cases, Hume insists on a sober accounting of what experience actually can justify. He does not deny that religion can play a meaningful role in human life. He simply asks, what does experience actually warrant when we cross the boundary from the natural world to theological claims? And because the empiricist's toolkit is a set of skeptical procedures designed to test inference, Hume's conclusion is not a sweeping denial of God's possibility. It is a disciplined limitation on what inferences from experience can amount to in the domain of ultimate causes and moral order. This is where two concrete examples become particularly instructive. The first is the philosophical challenge to design and teleology in natural religion. By insisting that analogy should not be mistaken for identity, by pressing the possibility that order may arise from impersonal necessity rather than from intelligent agency, and by pointing out the gaps and ambiguities in our knowledge of the designer's motives and attributes, Hume invites us to think with caution about what natural theology can establish. The second example concerns the everyday religious sentiment that accompanies moral and communal life. Hume does not call for the eradication of piety or the ritual life that binds a community. Rather, he treats that sentiment as a natural outgrowth of human sociability, sympathy, and moral imagination. The religious life, in Hume's account, emerges from human psychology and social needs. It is not itself a disproof of the possibility of God. It is a form of human experience that must be interpreted with empirical humility. These two examples illuminate how Hume's empiricist framework can accommodate the social and moral dimensions of religion while still resisting the leap to metaphysical certainty. If we pause here to acknowledge the counterarguments, we can anticipate two robust lines of defense that have persisted into modern times. The first line, defenders of natural theology, contests Hume's critique by insisting that probability can justify belief in a benevolent order even if it does not produce mathematical certainty. Proponents in the historical tradition argue that the cumulative weight of plausible inferences from order toward purpose can accumulate into a reasonable basis for belief. They might push back against the burden of extraordinary testimony by arguing that a rational agent should count design as a plausible explanation given the coherence of the universe with a teleological story. They may also deploy contemporary versions of the teleological argument that appeal to probabilities, statistical fine-tuning arguments, for example, and claim that even in the absence of irrefutable proofs, probabilistic support can still be adequate for rational belief in God's existence or benevolence. The second line of defense is modern defenses of religious experience and the cognitive science of religion. Here, the claim shifts from treating religious belief as a metaphysical proof to understanding belief as a psychological propensity that has historically served human needs. To make sense of mortality, to coordinate social life, to regulate behavior, and to cultivate solidarity. In this view, religious experience is not a demonstration of God's existence, but a robust set of cognitive dispositions that produce certain patterns of belief under particular conditions, appealing to the mind's tendencies to pattern seeking, to agency detection, to social cohesion. From this angle, one can interpret religious phenomena not as propositions about the metaphysical order, but as natural outputs of the human mind in social and cultural contexts. The Kantian, the Spinozan, and even the Berkeleyan lines of thought, each in their way, circle these questions from different angles. Berkeley, with his immaterialist insistence that kept the focus on perception and mind as the only sure ground of reality, offers a counterpoint that can be radicalized into a critique of natural theology's confidence in a public material cosmos as its stage. Spinoza, for his part, collapses the same stage into a single, sufficient cause, God or nature, whose order is not a matter of design but of necessity and rational structure. Descartes, with his search for certain knowledge, offers the methodological caution that even clear and distinct ideas must be tied to a solid epistemic foundation, lest the mental instruments outpace the world they aim to describe. The long history of debate among these figures, Berkeleyan immaterialism, Spinoza's God-nature, and Descartes' rationalist assurance, still provides the background against which Hume's contemporary empiricism should be read. It is not that Hume negates every religious impulse. It is that he asks for a stricter test of inference when religious claims reach beyond the sphere of plain, verifiable experience. Two historical anecdotes help illuminate the texture of Hume's project in this domain. The first concerns the publication history of the dialogues concerning natural religion and its reception after Hume's death. The dialogues were written in the 1740s but were not published until after Hume's death in 1779, and even then under unusual circumstances. A contested manuscript, parish tensions, and the care with which his friend and editor, Earl of Charlemont, weighed the political and religious sensitivities of the time. The dialogues were widely read and debated in the Enlightenment, but they were also treated with caution by religious authorities who feared that the dialogues' frank exploration of skepticism would undermine public faith. The posthumous reception was not a single chorus, but a complex conversation among readers who heard in the text a call to sober inquiry, a shield against credulity, and a reminder that philosophy must attend to the limits of human knowledge. That historical texture matters because it shows how Hume's method, empirical, cautious, and patient, could be deployed not only to pry open philosophical questions, but also to influence the broader cultural discourse about religion. The second anecdote regards Hume's influence on later secular and religious thought in the Enlightenment and beyond, including his connection to Kant and to the broader critique of metaphysical claims. Kant's famous remark that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers marks a crucial turning point in the history of philosophy. Kant's critical project was, in part, a response to Hume's empirical challenge. If our knowledge claims must be grounded in the conditions of possible experience, how then can we claim knowledge of things in themselves or of God? The impact of Hume's critique extended well beyond distance from religion. It forced a re-examination of how morality, meaning, and rationality could be defended in a framework that acknowledged the limits of what experience can justify. In the decades after Hume, the Enlightenment's religious debates shifted in important ways. Less confident metaphysical claims about God's nature and more attention to moral philosophy, human psychology, and the social functions of religion. This shift is visible in the ways Kant, and later figures in German idealism and British empiricism, reframed religious questions in terms of practical reason, moral duty, and the limits of theoretical knowledge. Hume's influence is not a simple demolition of the religious project. It is a recalibration, the insistence that epistemic humility should accompany any claim about ultimate causes and divine purposes. Across centuries, then, Hume's critique has spoken to a chain of interlocutors. To connect him with Berkeley, Spinoza, and Descartes in a single narrative is to trace the long, winding road of theistic and natural philosophical debates. Berkeley's immaterialism challenges the idea that the cosmos's public order can be uncritically linked to a public, external existence that guarantees the truth of religious assertions. If the secure ground of reality lies in perception, then natural theology must contend with the way that perception constitutes reality itself. Spinoza's God, Deus sive natura, identifies God with the entire order of nature, dissolving the sense of a distinct creator who acts in the world and replacing it with a single, rational order that is identical with God. In the dialogues, the design argument can be read as playing with a version of the problem that Spinoza's system would take more radically. Is the divine order the same as human cognitive comfort in the face of uncertainty? Descartes' rationalist clarity offers a different challenge. To ensure the certainty of metaphysical claims, one would need a foundation that can withstand skepticism even when the senses mislead. Hume's empiricism interrupts the confidence that any of these positions can claim a straightforward route to religious truth. Yet the dialogue remains part of a broader history in which the questions are not exhausted by mere denial. Rather, the questions are reframed, inviting more nuanced accounts of how belief, imagination, and community life interweave with the fabric of rational inquiry. Turning to the broader arc of Hume's influence, it is worth noting how his work reorganized modern philosophy of religion. The critical turn, what we might call a turn toward empirical skepticism as a method for handling religious claims, became a standard move in later philosophical analysis. The idea that religious beliefs should be judged by their relation to experience, by their coherence with the best evidence available, rather than by appeals to authority or revelation, became a core disposition of secular and religious thinkers alike. In the realm of religious experience and cognitive science of religion, the modern conversation often begins from a recognition that religious belief might be understood as a pattern in human cognition, a feature of how human beings think rather than a direct problem of metaphysical proof. This shift does not erase religion, it reframes it. It invites us to consider how beliefs arise, how communities sustain them, and how moral life can be compatible with a range of epistemic positions. Hume's insistence on empirical scrutiny embedded in the ethical and social dimensions of religion, the sense that religion belongs to the human life world as a practical discipline, not a metaphysical monopoly, continues to echo through debates about secularism, religious tolerance, and pluralism. In making these arguments, it is helpful to connect back to some explicit cross-references to other thinkers who illuminate the long conversation. Berkeley's immaterialism reminds us that to speak of the external world as an object of knowledge is always to speak through mental representation and perception. The question then about natural theology becomes not only a question of what exists out there, but a question of how we know what exists and what counts as adequate justification for belief. Spinoza's God as nature's rational order reframes the entire discussion of design and providence, suggesting that the divine is not a separate agent who acts and intervenes in human history, but the necessary cause of all that exists in its most comprehensive sense. Descartes offers the quest for certain knowledge, a standard that pushes us to demand more stringent justification even for religious belief. And in the background, one sees a culture of skepticism and inquiry that Hume helps to crystallize. The idea that the mind's natural preferences, its sympathy, its desire for coherence, its fear of chaos, must be disentangled from the truth of metaphysical claims. In turning to contemporary readings, it is worth noting how cognitive science of religion has reframed debates about the religious imagination. Current discussions often describe religious belief as a consequence of how the human mind is wired. It is a byproduct of cognitive biases, agency detection systems, event-full causal reasoning, and a predisposition toward teleological explanations. From this perspective, belief in gods or divine programs can be understood as a natural categorical tendency, rather than as a rational demonstration of metaphysical truths. The upshot is not that religion disappears under this lens, but that its psychological and socio-cultural dimensions become central to understanding how religion operates in communities. Philosophers of religion, too, have engaged these topics by asking whether religious epistemology should be formulated in terms of inference to the best explanation, pragmatic justification, or moral rationality. And they have become more attentive to the role of religious experiences, visions, feelings of awe, moral compulsion, as possibly legitimate, though not necessarily invincible, sources of religious significance. Two concrete movements in interpretation stand out. First, natural theology as a project is often read as more vulnerable against Hume's critique than it appears to superficial readers. Yet some contemporary theologians and philosophers have tried to salvage a form of natural theology that is aligned with modern physics, cosmology, and biology, arguing that the order of the universe still invites inquiry about the possibility of a divine ground, even if the epistemic path is more nuanced and ambiguous. They seek a synthesis that respects empirical boundaries while keeping space for metaphysical reflection about meaning, purpose, and the moral dimension of the world. Second, modern defenses of religious experience and the cognitive story of religion do not claim to prove God's existence in a traditional sense. Instead, they aim to defend a robust and meaningful religious life by showing how faith can be a natural response to human cognitive architecture and social life. They insist that religious belief can be rational in a different sense, coherent with human psychology, valuable for community, and morally intelligible within a broader ethical framework. If Hume's voice is heard in these debates, it is as a cautionary tutor. He presses us to be honest about the strength of our evidence, to distinguish our hopes and feelings from the claims we make about the world, and to examine how much of what we value in religion arises from our nature rather than from the nature of reality itself. In contemplating the path forward for expanded engagement with these themes, it may help to visualize a map with 5 robust, interconnected sections. First, natural religion and empirical skepticism would ground the discussion in the dialogues, the main thrust of the teleological critique, and the role of inference in correlating experience with metaphysical claims. Second, the miracles argument revisited would rehearse the of miracles argument in its detailed Bayesian spirit, tracing how testimonial evidence interacts with background probabilities in everyday belief and institutional claims. Third, Hume and the religious imagination would foreground the social, moral, and psychological dimensions of religion as they arise in human life, not merely in metaphysical contestation. Fourth, posthumous reception and influences would tell the story of how the dialogues in Hume's broader corpus shaped Kant, later Enlightenment philosophers, and modern rationalists and empiricists alike, how his voice helped to reconfigure debates about the rationality of belief, the nature of knowledge, and the place of religion in public life. Fifth, contemporary readings in cognitive science of religion and philosophy of religion would connect to ongoing work about religious cognition, experimental philosophy, and the interpretative strategies that allow a robust, plural, and morally meaningful conversation about faith in a secular age. Before we close, I want to place Hume's project in a few memorable terms. He is not the enemy of faith, he is the friend of clarity. He asks us to distinguish between what is worth believing because it is likely to be true, what we believe because it consoles us, and what we believe because a tradition commands it. He warns us against letting the aura of wonder do the epistemic heavy lifting for us, against imagining that experience automatically yields high-grade metaphysical knowledge, and against the temptation to mistake reverence for justification. He invites us to cultivate a mature relationship to religion, one that respects human moral life, social bonds, and the rich texture of religious imagination, while insisting that the claim to metaphysical certainty remains tethered to the strongest tests of experience and reason. In the end, the story of Hume's philosophy of religion is not a single verdict but a long conversation. He contributed a method, a way of testing claims against the weight of experience, of analyzing the strength of testimony, of keeping moral life and empirical inquiry in dialogue with one another. He did not close the door on religion. He opened a more careful door, one that encourages intellectual humility and fosters a more nuanced understanding of the many ways human beings seek meaning, solace, and community. If the dialogues teach us anything, it is that questions about God, design, and the constitution of the universe resist the ease of categorical answers. They demand an armistice between wonder and restraint. And if the of miracles teaches us anything, it is that our most persuasive beliefs about the extraordinary require an extraordinary standard of evidence, one that remains essential for the health of inquiry, both in philosophy and in daily life. As we consider the project in an ongoing way, it may be helpful to imagine a practical plan for expanding this exploration toward a larger, more expansive study. We might begin with a thorough exegesis of natural religion and empirical skepticism, unpacking the arguments in the dialogues line by line, examining the structure of the design argument, the critiques offered by Philo, and the subtle ways in which Hume's skepticism reframes the debate about divine agency. We could then devote a substantial section to the miracles argument revisited, laying out the probabilistic reasoning, the role of witness testimony, and a careful comparison with competing theories of evidence. We would add a separate chapter on Hume and the religious imagination, exploring the moral psychology of faith, the social bonds that sustain communities of belief, and the ways in which religious sentiment can be understood as an emergent property of human nature rather than a metaphysical proof. A fourth chapter would survey posthumous reception and influences, how Kant's critical turn refracted Hume's legacy, how the Enlightenment engaged with skepticism and theology, and how later thinkers reinterpreted or reoriented religious claims in light of Humean insights. A final chapter would address contemporary readings in cognitive science of religion and philosophy of religion, connecting empirical research on religious cognition with philosophical questions about justification, meaning, and epistemic integrity. In this final section, we would also test to what extent modern defenses of religious belief can accommodate Hume's insistence on empirical discipline, and whether new models of explanation, neuroscientific, evolutionary, and cultural, can offer a coherent, responsible, and humane account of religious life. To close with a note of continuity, the pursuit of truth in philosophy of religion is not a mere logical puzzle. It is a human enterprise that touches how we live, how we relate to others, and what we owe to the world we inhabit. Hume's legacy in this field is a call to balance reverence with reason, wonder with evidence, and the longing for ultimate causes with the humility that experience rightly inspires. In the quiet moments of reflection, when a person contemplates the starry sky or the moral life of a community, Hume invites us to listen for the sound of the world speaking back to us, not with certainty, but with the kind of measured, patient clarity that allows us to walk forward with integrity. If we attend to that call, the history of philosophy of religion, with its Berkeleyan debates, its Spinozan horizons, its Cartesian insistence on certainty, and its Kantian reorientations, will continue to illuminate not only what we think about God, but how we think about thinking itself. And in that light, Hume's work remains not a final word, but a compass, guiding us through the precise, sometimes jagged terrain where faith, reason, and life meet.